Jonathan's body began to smoke as his golden divinity poured into him, and his body started to light up with power. His hands twitched, and then he reached out, grabbing onto the monster's throat. It gurgled, and Jonathan pushed himself off the creature's blade, landing in front of it with a heavy thud. He drew his fist back, packing as much of his remaining power into it as he could, and then surged forwards, whipping it around in a tight arc, leaving an afterimage in the air. His fist slammed into the already existing hole in the monster's body, and the flesh ruptured, blasting chunks out of its midsection. The undead fell over backwards, its body unable to support its weight anymore. Jonathan was running out of time, as the other undead were racing towards him, but he had enough time to finish this. The undead lying on the ground grimaced, and then began to chant something under its breath, as Jonathan approached. He drew back his fist, and struck, just as the undead finished off its spell. A thread of dark light reached out from its hand towards Jonathan, and sunk into his flesh. He was suddenly beset with a terrifying feeling of weakness, but he still completed his attack, pulping the monster's head against the ground. A wave of dark energy rushed out of its body, and into the other undead, causing them to fall to the ground, lifeless husks once more. Essence surged out of the corpses, and into Jonathan's body, propelling him upwards in level, more than he had been expecting. He gained 3 entire levels from that fight, and he smiled as the power filled his body, healing him fully. He looked down at the shriveled corpse in front of him, all that remained of the powerful being that had almost killed him. The undead had been quite powerful, and Jonathan had almost died there. If not for his sudden discovery of a new talent within himself, he would have died. To reward this, he was met with many notifications, all pertaining to his advancement in the field of runecrafting. The first one was a set of notifications that told him that he had advanced in his pathway skills. Runecrafting has reached Student 9. TrueSight has reached Student 7. Finding the ability to edit the runes within his skills had pushed him upwards rapidly, granting him great bonuses in both fields. He sensed that he was getting close to a breakthrough with both of the skills, and he was looking forward to what he would find in doing so. In addition, he had gained a new skill prompted by his on-the-fly altering of his impact skill. You have gained a new skill. Sense the Weave, Legendary. You may look into the depths of your skills, and directly change the runes that are located there. Doing so will take a great toll on your body, increasing exponentially with every rune that you alter. Be sure that you do not push past your limits, as only death awaits there. While active, this skill can increase the output of your skills in a way that is relative to which rune you have empowered. To empower a rune, you must have knowledge of its concept and enough basic understanding to know its form. It was a great skill, and one that he would certainly be experimenting with over the coming days. He knew that this was the gateway to greater power that he had been waiting for with his unique situation, and he would have to leverage it to greater heights. The cost in pain and damage was annoying, and quite concerning too given how deadly it could be in battle, but it was worth it in the end. He had utterly transformed as a fighter while under the influence of that skill, and it was undeniably powerful. However, he would have to regulate its usage, similarly to Smite. There would come a day when both skills were too weak to even bother using, but for now, they were last resort options, only to be utilized when all else failed. Jonathan sighed, and exited his interface, deciding to wait until later to check on his status screen. There were no large changes to it in any case, so there was nothing to bother looking at. Jonathan made his way out of the cathedral, keeping his eyes away from the resting bodies of the undead. It almost felt perverse to be standing in there with them now, after they had met their final ends. It was like he was trespassing on the resting place of an entire civilization, and as far as he knew, he was. There clearly had been more to this place than met the eye, considering what the undead had told him. Jonathan decided to stay here a little while longer, both to practice his abilities in peace and to find out more about the legacy of this city. From what he could tell, they had not been under the thumb of Granath, which was surprising. Given that the undead leader had spoken about the people of the ash heaps, as being something other to itself, told Jonathan that there had once been two rival civilizations within this world. Of course, all that was left now was this city, but there were certainly secrets hidden within this place. A few hours later, Jonathan found himself standing in front of what looked to be an open burial pit, that stretched down into the darkness of the earth. A spiraling passageway extended down into the darkness, and there was a faint presence lurking in the place, almost as if some being dwelled within there. That being was either severely weakened, or long gone, but its trace remained. Jonathan summoned a ball of mana to his hand, in preparation for the pitch darkness, and took a wary step down onto the staircase. There was a resounding crack, and he leaped backwards just in time as the stone shattered into pieces, showering down towards the bottom of the pit. Something hissed down there, and Jonathan grimaced. There was certainly some monster down there, even if it was not the owner of the presence that Jonathan had felt. From what he had heard, the pit was about 100 feet deep. It was surrounded by a few of the ash-covered ruins that dotted this area, and seemed to be a part of their structure, given the way that they were placed around it. It clearly had been some sort of important feature within the city, given its prominence. Jonathan leaned over the edge, and then decided to go down into it. He lowered himself over the side with his hands, and then began to scale the side of the wall, heading down into the pit. The sides were smooth, but he was able to create handholds for himself with his mana, making small spherical depressions in the wall in order to hold himself up with. He could hold himself up quite easily at this point, meaning that he didn't have to make the holes with any sort of grace. Jonathan clambered down this way, and reached the bottom a minute later, leaving a trail of small holes lining the wall of the pit. He leaped off at the last stretch, and landed securely on the ground, which was a mix of loose ash and what looked to be powdered bone. A rumbling growl came from behind him, and Jonathan whirled around to see an undead ash prowler hissing at him, its body rotting away and its bones exposed. The creature seemed to be quite weak, and it was more wary of him than aggressive. Perhaps an ash prowler had become stuck down here, and had been warped by some strange magic after its death, turning into an undead like the other creatures within this city. Jonathan snaked forwards, and closed the gap almost instantly, pulverizing the monster with his right fist. As he had suspected, it was very weak. He stepped over the corpse of the beast, and summoned a ball of mana to his hand, illuminating the passageway in front of himself. There were 3 hallways that extended outwards from this part of the pit, which seemed to be some sort of entrance. The middle hallway was the largest, but the other 2 seemed intriguing as well. Each of them had the same faint presence that Jonathan had felt from above dwelling within them. He cautiously chose the middle path first, as he could simply come back if he needed to. Jonathan did not feel any fear in this place, which was a bit surprising to him, but he supposed that he had gone through much worse in his time in the infinite hells than a little bit of darkness and some undead. They just didn't hold the same fear in him anymore. Jonathan started down the hallway, noting that there was a slight slope to it. The walls were lined with what looked like places for coffins, and most of them were filled. These coffins were made out of metal, and were inscribed with strange glyphs. Perhaps they were created so as to not let any undead out of them. In any case, nothing awakened as Jonathan walked by the coffins, which told him that whoever had lived here had been aware of the undead curse that had been placed over this place. Jonathan swiveled his light around now and again, getting a better look at the coffins. There were words written on the bases of each of the coffins, which bore a name and some prosaic eulogy. Jonathan only spared these a few moments of notice, and did not stop walking as he went deeper and deeper into the pit. The further he went, the colder it became, until his breaths came out like clouds of frost in the air. The cold didn't bother him, but it was still interesting to find. It shouldn't have dropped that much in such a short time. The coffins were beginning to grow larger and more ornate too, and some of the ones here had gold inlays on them. Wherever had been buried here had clearly been someone of import. Jonathan decided to check one of the coffins out in greater detail, and he walked over to a nearby one, shining his light on it. He made out a name and an expression carved into the base of the coffin, and he read it out to himself. Almer Savern. Lost, corrupted, but never forgotten. I wonder what it means by that. The last part of the inscription was a bit strange, but Jonathan assumed that it had something to do with the creation of undead within this place. Jonathan left the side of the coffin and kept on going, down further and further into the pit. By this point, the chill was arctic, and the coffins were all made out of what looked to be pure gold. Jonathan had no idea what the metal was worth in this place, but he wondered if it would be a good idea to take some of it back with him. From what he had seen, in movies and in books back on Earth, plundering the remains of the dead was a bad idea, especially in a world where they were perfectly willing to rise back up and kill you. Jonathan decided against it for now, and ignored the coffins from now on. Eventually, he came to the end of the tunnel, which led into a large cavern, filled with strange ruins and with a pedestal at its center. There were monsters patrolling the area, vast undead creatures that did not look like any living creature of the ash heaps that Jonathan had ever seen. There was a 20-foot drop down into the cavern, which was barely worth noticing to Jonathan at this point. He studied the pedestal at the center of the cavern, and found that it had a small book on it, which was surrounded by a red force field. It was that relic that the monsters seemed to be protecting, seeing as there was nothing else within the area of any note. Jonathan studied the room, trying to see if it would be possible for him to get to the book and abscond before the monsters got to him. He decided to scan the creatures first and paled at what he saw. Corpse giant, boss. Level. He had never seen that marking before, which only meant one thing. These things were tier 2. Jonathan stood there for a moment, in abject awe and terror of the monsters in front of him. There were 3 of the creatures, each of which looked to be modeled after the skeletal structure of some quadrupedal beast. They were gigantic creatures, and they carried a weight that went beyond the physical variety. One of these monsters would be more than a match for Jonathan, let alone 3 of them. He sighed, and prepared to leave, glad that he had not gotten the attention of the creatures. However, a sudden pulse came from the book in the center of the cavern, and Jonathan turned around, almost subconsciously. He could feel a beckoning call coming from the book, and he had to force himself to resist. It was as if there was something within that book that resonated with him on a deep, conceptual level, and he knew that he needed to get it. However, he wasn't suicidal, and he managed to calm himself down before he leaped down amid the monsters. The feeling diminished, but it was still there. He waited for it to dissipate completely, but it did not. It seemed that until he claimed the book, there would be some sort of lure on his psyche until he was able to get to it. Jonathan gritted his teeth, but he could sense no way out of this predicament. He tried to move further away from the book, going back up the passageway, but the itch quickly turned into a searing pain, and he capitulated, heading back towards the cavern. He was caught, body and soul, and the only way he could escape was to get to the book. Perhaps this was some sort of trap set by the creators of this place, but Jonathan doubted it. The book felt, for lack of a better word, right to him. It was as if he needed it in order to fully realize his potential. Jonathan had no other alternative but to get to it. He studied the movements of the monsters intently, noting that they seemed to be moving on predetermined tracks. They never got more than 500 feet away from the book, and never closer than 300 feet to the cavern wall. Their senses seemed to be dulled as well, as none of them had detected him yet. Jonathan edged over towards the side of the drop-off to the cavern, and waited for some time, trying to get the timing down on the movements of the monsters. They were all on different paths, winding around the center in a way that no mortal being would have been able to keep up perfectly for so long. Jonathan noticed that there were a few more of the glyphs that he had seen on the coffins on the ground, tracing out the lines that the monsters were following. If he was able to disable those lines, then perhaps he would be free to claim the book in the center. The only problem was that he would only have one shot at this, and he knew that even if he managed to disable one of the monsters, the other ones would then be after his blood. Jonathan picked up a small chunk of rock off the ground, and eyed up his target, trying to aim for a tiny spot in the center of the nearest line. His body locked into place as he did so, allowing him to make the throw without a single millimeter of movement. His enhanced senses and dexterity ensured that his rock went off perfectly, and his superior strength ensured that it went in a straight line, making it so that he did not have to account for any deviance. In addition, his enhanced intelligence allowed him to calculate the trajectory in real time. In short, he had become a pretty damn good baseball player now. Jonathan watched as the stone rocketed through the air, straight on course for its target. There was a sharp retort like a gunshot, and the stone shattered. The glyph that it had struck flared with a bright light, and then exploded, sending up a small cloud of debris. The monster that had been tracing that line out stiffened, and then turned towards Jonathan, a bright light building within its empty jaws. Jonathan swore and ducked just as a beam of black energy shot out of its mouth, and burned through the roof behind him. There was a hole running all the way to the surface where it had hit, and Jonathan was glad that he had not been struck by that attack. However, the lack of noise from down in the cavern meant that the monster had been somewhat subdued by his idea. He looked down over the edge once more, noticing that the monster had run out of energy, and was now simply looking up at him, trying to recover its power. He could already see the way that he would have to do this. The rings that the monsters were running along intersected one another, and they were able to cover all of the blind spots of the other two creatures. However, if he was able to disable the glyphs in the right spots, and bait out an attack from the monsters all at one time, he would be able to enter the cavern and abscond with the book before he was blasted into atoms. Jonathan began to gather rocks, of which he was going to need a lot. If this was to work, he would need a lot of stones to account for his error. The first strike had been easy enough, but he would have to account for more variables on the later throws, especially the ones targeting the third ring, which was shielded from his view somewhat by the large monsters that were standing there. He was also quite a bit further away from that one, by about double the distance. Jonathan waited until he was sure of his safety, and then lobbed a second one of the rocks towards the second ring in the cavern. His aim was true, but one of the monsters sent off a beam of energy that knocked the strike out of the air, causing it to fall to the ground, in a pile of dust. It seemed that they had been alerted to his attacks now, and this would not be as easy of a task as he had thought. As he realized what this meant, he ducked, as a trio of beams shot through the space where his head had been, burrowing up into the ground. He had almost lost his head from that triple strike, but at least he knew that he had some time now before more of the attacks came his way. Jonathan took another rock up from his pile, and threw it towards the second ring, trying to block off the section of the cavern facing him. His strike landed true, and the glyph exploded, locking the monster out of the area that it guarded. Jonathan pumped his fist, and then threw another rock, as the corpse giant rounded the corner of the ring, managing to separate another part of the ring from it. Now there was a tunnel that was about 50 feet wide going straight towards the center of the cavern, that he could potentially run along. All that stood between him and the book was the final circle of the array laid out before him. Jonathan readied another rock, but he noticed that the monsters were almost ready to fire again, and he ducked down as they did so, watching as the powerful attacks shot up through the ceiling above him. They contained quite a bit of power, and Jonathan was glad that the monsters were not intelligent enough to use them properly. By his count, it took about 15 seconds for the creature to charge up their attacks fully, which meant that his avenue for success in removing the book was so small that it was almost non-existent. He would have to cross almost half a mile of distance to get the book, all while trying to make it out in time to avoid a blast that would end his life. No big deal. Jonathan sprang up, and tossed the final rock, destroying a part of the third ring with it. As the corpse giant defending that part of the cavern charged around its ring, trying to get to the damaged part, he threw another one that blocked off the other half of the ring. Jonathan waited there for a few more seconds to bait out another beam attack, and as the lances of dark energy shot up above his head, he slipped over the side of the cavern wall, and was off running towards the book. He unleashed all of his speed, taxing his muscles in the process. Streaking across the ground at over 500 miles per hour really taxed his body, but he was able to maintain it for long enough to make a difference. He was now moving so fast that he was akin to a superhero from any of those comics back on Earth, and he certainly had the strength to back it up as well. He was rapidly turning out to be some sort of Superman. By the time that he had reached the first ring, his stamina was a quarter gone, and he was forced to slow down a little. The corpse giant that was locked within the ring there snarled at him, and tried to get past the edge of the glyph barrier, but found that it was unable to. Jonathan ignored it, not wanting to waste even a second of valuable time, and crossed the second ring 2 seconds later. He calculated the time that he had left, and realized that he needed to pick up the pace some more. Groaning in pain, Jonathan forced himself to go back at his top speed for a bit, reaching the final ring barely a second later. He streaked past its guardian, and reached the pedestal a moment later, grabbing the book off of it. A sense of complete warmth enveloped him, as if the universe was happy with his actions. He almost stumbled, but then remembered where he was, and he circled around, running back towards the edge of the cavern. Jonathan moved like the devil was on his tail, and he reached the edge of the cavern in record time, blitzing past the defenders of the book. He was left with barely 3 seconds on the clock as he reached the wall, and he desperately started to haul himself up it by one hand, thrusting his fist into the solid rock to create handholds. He could have put the book into his storage device, but he sensed that something would happen if he did so, something bad. As a result, he kept it under his arm. By the time that he was halfway up, he was out of time, and he heard the monsters behind him preparing to fire. There was no way that he would be able to dodge a full-on attack from this range, and his only hope was in his touch of decay skill. As he heard the beams fire, time seemed to slow around him, and he sent an expanding dome of energy out from him, seeking out the attacks coming his way. He instantly knew that it was too weak to matter, and it would peter out long before reaching the beams. However, he had a trick up his sleeve. Burning divinity at a drastic rate, Jonathan sent his awareness up and into his skill, searching for a specific rune. Finding the rune of beckoning glistening the center of his skill matrix, Jonathan pumped power into it, sending new life into his skill. The dome expanded outwards much faster than before, and it seemed to be drawn to the attacks coming its way. The fabric of the skill bunched up in the air, and shielded Jonathan from harm, causing the black beams to ricochet up into the ceiling. Jonathan almost fell off the wall, his heart racing and his mind aflame, but he kept going, clambering over the edge of the cavern wall a moment later. He rolled forwards, and then raced up the hallways, back towards the safety of the area with the coffins. He had achieved his goal, but he had almost died in the process. The book was still under his arm, and it was releasing a siren song of desire to him, telling him to open it and read the pages within. Jonathan acquiesced, and opened the first page of the book. A tendril of red light shot out of the book, and into his face, connecting him with the tome for a moment. Then it retracted, and the book fully opened, letting him see what was written on the page. If you are reading this book, that must mean that you passed its karmic background, and are karmically aligned with our path. I do not know what year, or eon, that this book has been discovered in, but you are possibly the last person who follows our creed. We were once a large and proud sect, fighting for justice within the infinite hells. Back when Granath was not the monumental threat that he is now, and there was still hope within this circle, we fought for our freedom, to turn our circle of hell into a small slice of heaven instead. However, over the years, we dwindled in number, and Granath and his legions grew in power. I do not know of the fate of our brethren in the higher planes, but I assume that they too have faded to insignificance. You are the last hope of our people. Jonathan turned the page, and began to read the book in earnest. I am Archdeacon Patrolanus of the Church of the Redeeming Light, and I consecrate this book in the name of justice and peace within these lands. The contained words are a story of the exploits, the rise and the fall, of my faction over the years. After this was the first chunk of text, which Jonathan immediately realized was written for the purpose of powerful beings, as it was in incredibly small font. The words were like grains of dust, and only because of his enhanced senses could he read them. The penmanship that must have gone into this book was astounding, and Jonathan looked closer at the words, marveling at how perfect they were, even at such a small scale. There must be millions of words within this book, if not more, and Jonathan knew that he could not read it now. However, he wanted to find out why he had felt a sense of doom when he had tried to place it into the storage device. He flipped through the pages, and on the 345th page, he found a strange glyph engraved into the paper, one that glowed with a faint light. He tapped on it, and a pendant fell out of thin air in front of the book, and into his hand. It looked like a 10-pointed star, with a rising sun in the center of the design. Words appeared on the page a moment later. This pendant will mark you as a member of the church to any remaining members. Use it well. If you are ever in need, this pendant will prove useful, but only once. In addition, you may now store this book within any storage device, as the dimensional recursion used to store this pendant is now gone. Jonathan put the pendant on, and then stored the book away in his bag. He would have ample time to peruse the pages later on, and he suspected that it would take quite a while to do so. He was looking forward to the wealth of knowledge that it would provide. Before coming to his world, Jonathan had always been a clever individual, but he had never been interested in knowledge for knowledge's sake. However, now that the things that he was learning actually had some sort of meaning to his life, unlike the endless legions of equations that he had been forced to solve for his math class, he was hooked. Before he left, there were still 2 other tunnels to check out however, and Jonathan jogged back to the front of the hallway, and took a turn towards the right. The first tunnel was smaller than the one he had just come out of, and it had a strange musty odor to it, as if something had died in here long ago, and had not been properly disposed of. It was the same smell that he had gotten off the undead back in the cathedral. This tunnel was arranged the same as the other one, with rows of coffins lining the walls, but these coffins had been breached by some unseen force, and the bottoms had broken open, revealing an emptiness inside. Whoever had been inside these vessels were long gone now, and Jonathan suspected that they were now undead, unless they had since expired. He kept on walking, finding that the tunnel narrowed the further he went. There was no cavern waiting at the end of it, only a blank stone wall, with a few markings on it. They were the same glyphs that he had seen all throughout the complex, and he was beginning to wonder what exactly they meant. They were clearly something to do with a skill, and seemed to be hearkening after the power of his runes, but on a far less grand scale. If the runic language was like calculus, this was like a series of pictograms on some caveman's wall. He was the only person to have ever discovered the runes, but it was inevitable that someone somewhere else would have found a system of power similar to them. Jonathan moved over to the glyphs, and peered at them, trying to figure out what their purpose was. He could see minor similarities between them and the runes that he knew, but the differences were minuscule, and barely there at all. Besides, he already had access to the magic of the runes, and he did not need to find some sort of inferior system in order to progress further. Jonathan turned around, ready to leave, only to face a small army of undead. In the time that he had spent admiring the wall, about 50 of the humanoid undead had snuck up on him, presumably from the coffins. Jonathan had no idea where they had come from, seeing as the coffins had been empty, but he looked up, and noticed that there was a large hole on the ceiling of the tunnel, which led off into blackness. That was where they had come from. Jonathan clenched his fists, and prepared for a slaughter. He pushed off, bringing his right fist to his side in preparation for a punch. Purple light flared around his fist as he moved, and he sent the red power of his divinity-enhanced rune of hatred in to join it. He crossed the 20-odd feet in a fraction of a second, leaving a violent gust of wind in his wake. He was approaching sonic speeds now, which was quite impressive in his book. Jonathan transferred all of his momentum into his fist, stopping himself just before the barreled into the undead. It landed with a mighty thump on the torso of the closest undead, causing it to explode in a shower of desiccated flesh. The shockwave traveled into the nearby undead, so tightly packed were their numbers, and they were blasted apart as well, leaving Jonathan with a few less of the undead to deal with. The others chased and filed forwards, trying to get to him. However, without the leader that Jonathan had fought in the cathedral, their efforts were completely useless. Jonathan leaped backwards, avoiding their grasping hands, and began to weave together an ultra-condensed ball of mana in his hands. Propelling it to the top of his fist with his will, Jonathan drove his fist straight through a row of the undead, his hand breaking through the abdomens of 3 of the monstrosities. They fell backwards when he withdrew his hand, and lay on the ground, inert. These undead seemed to be weaker than the ones that he had faced before, and he would have put their level at around level 50, or lower. Without the buffs and bonuses from the undead leader, these monsters were like chaff before Jonathan, who was probably on par with a non-enhanced level 80 or so now. He still had almost an eternity to go, and he reminded himself of the power of Granath before the hubris set in. He had been told that the monster was able to destroy a city in a matter of minutes, which, while he did not know the veracity of that statement, gave a ballpark estimate of what he was going to be up against. By the time that he was fighting Granath, he would have to be able to take out an entire village in a single attack, which seemed almost unfathomable to him. However, if he was able to develop his mana and void abilities further, then he might have a chance. Jonathan kept this guiding star in mind as he ripped through the encroaching undead, barely getting any usable essence from them. The creatures were mostly mindless, and they kept pressing themselves forwards, trying to get to Jonathan. He could have jumped over their heads from the very beginning, but this was a good exercise for his martial abilities. As he fought, he began to slowly lower the amount of strength that he was using, feeling the system enhancements withdrawing from his body. He was unsure of how exactly he was doing this, but he suspected that because of the fact that his strength came from an outside force, he would modulate it a bit better than his natural strength. In addition, it was perfectly possible to limit one's strength, even back on Earth. This was simply on a larger scale. Jonathan eventually dropped down to about half of his effective strength and speed, allowing him to fight on a more equal level with these monsters. His martial abilities only ranked up when he was using them to their fullest potential, which meant limiting his strength. It seemed to be counterintuitive, but one day, when he was facing off against a much stronger opponent, he would be thanking himself for doing this. Jonathan practiced his forms, running through the movements of Flowing Hurricane in his mind. It was a flashy name for a martial skill set, but it was very accurate. His body was the eye of the storm, and his fists and legs were the winds that surrounded it, tearing apart anything that they touched. As he began to visualize the path that he was following, he had a sudden vision of a man in pitch-black armor, splitting worlds with a single punch, solely through the perfection of his skill. There was no strength used there, only the sheer power of the man's connection to his martial path. The vision disappeared within milliseconds, but the image was still seared into Jonathan's mind. As the image had disappeared, he had caught a glimpse of the man's face. It had been him. If he could one day use that level of power, then he would be so far beyond anything that he could even comprehend that he would barely be able to remember his humble origins. A planetary level of destruction was something that Jonathan had never witnessed before, seeing as such events were extremely rare back in his own universe. The only times that could ever happen were in events like supernovas, or with black holes. For a single man to be able to do something like that was mind-boggling. The vision felt as if it had come from his martial technique specifically, as if it was trying to communicate with him. Jonathan shook his head to clear his mind, and continued to tear through the undead, whittling down their numbers with his martial techniques. He was able to use his redirection and impact skills to their fullest now that his strikes did not just instantly destroy his enemies, and he was enjoying how they worked in sync to make his attacks transform from brutal to downright devastating. Jonathan tore limbs off and cratered skulls with his punches, and used his attacks to transition into more. His fighting style was good at both prolonged melee fighting and with duels, and he was exploring its depths to their fullest here and now. Eventually, the last undead was reduced to a pile of rotting meat, and Jonathan took a deep breath, panting slightly from the exertion. He hadn't taken a single hit from the undead, which was quite surprising, given that he had been limiting his speed. His skills were increasing in leaps and bounds. A notification waited for him, and he eagerly opened it. You have reached student rank 3 with Flowing Hurricane. It was a welcome notification, and it meant that he was improving quite rapidly now. Unfortunately, there was no increase to his overarching martial arts skill, but it was to be expected, given that it was of a higher tier to his flowing hurricane skill. Something that would lead to an increase in the lesser of the skills would not be enough to lead to an increase in the higher of the two. Jonathan wiped off his hands, and continued on his way, exiting the tunnel a few minutes later. He turned around and ran towards the other tunnel, the one that he had not explored yet. Jonathan ran down it, noticing that it was basically the exact same thing as the other one, except without any sundered coffins. There was nothing of note in there, and Jonathan quickly left. He had explored every part of this area, and there was nothing useful here anymore. Jonathan reached the edge of the pit wall and then started to clamber up it, using his fists as pickaxes to break through the rock and created handholds for himself. He reached the top a few minutes later, clambering out into the city above. He had discovered many interesting things by simply wandering around the place, and he was not ready to leave yet. Jonathan stretched and then took off, running towards the center of the city. He was happy with his discoveries, but he was eager to find more. He had as much time as he needed here, and he was going to use it to the fullest. Over the next few hours, Jonathan made his way across the city, searching for anything else that might give him clues into the provenance of the book that he had found. It seemed that the strange space-bending effect that had prevented him from leaving had disappeared after he had defeated the undead in the cathedral, and he eventually came to the edge of the city. After having been in it for a decent amount of time, it was a little bit strange to suddenly be facing an empty expanse of ash. Jonathan turned around at the border, and started walking towards a point of interest on the nearby topography, which was a tower that had not been fully covered by the ash that had engulfed the rest of the city. The tower stood about 100 feet tall, and extended up into the sky like a finger pointing accusingly at the heavens. It was made out of stone, and was mostly ruined, with a jagged crack running up the sides. Jonathan had sensed something within it however, and he decided to follow his hunch, as he had followed the one earlier that had led him to the book in the burial pit. He walked cautiously up to its base, and studied the tower, noticing that it was ornately carved, despite being weathered by age. The carvings had been softened, but they were still visible, and they seemed to spell out the story of the city, with pictures of settlers milling around, building the ruins that lay around Jonathan. Of course, back then they had not been ruins, but rather proper buildings, rising out of the ash. Then the pictures began to grow darker in nature, and the inhabitants began to die, killed off by the forces of Granath. Eventually, there was a final carving, which was near the top of the tower, and barely visible to Jonathan, even with his enhanced eyesight, which was of Granath, depicted as a multi-hundred-foot-long worm, devouring the last defenders of the city, and reducing it to rubble. Jonathan raised one eyebrow, and then walked over to the door of the tower, heading in. The door had long since disappeared, but the reception area was still intact, and the vague suggestions of where sofas and chairs had once been still were visible, in the form of a few marks here and there. Jonathan ignored them for the most part however, and kept going, heading for the twisting staircase that led towards the top of the tower. It was crumbling in spots, but it seemed to be sturdy enough, and he didn't really have much to worry about in any case, even if he fell. Jonathan could survive such a fall without even a scratch on him. He took his first step onto the foreboding steps, and took another after he realized that they were completely safe. He picked up the pace, and walked up the staircase, looking at the engravings on the walls as he did so. It seemed that the people that had lived here had been fond of recording information in the forms of pictures or glyphs, and there was no change in that trend here. The walls were covered with various scenes, all of a markedly peaceful nature. There were pictures of children playing in the middle of the city, one of a trading caravan coming into the city, and a large group of people waiting to buy from them. Like with the outside however, the pictures slowly started to grow more sinister, and the staircase eventually ended with the same picture as had been on the top of the tower, of Granath devouring the citizens of the city. Jonathan shuddered, and walked past it, and onto the top of the tower. There was a faint wind blowing up here, an oddity in these parts, and Jonathan enjoyed the subtle breeze, taking off his helmet to feel it on his face. He looked out over the ash heaps, feeling a sense of discovery, almost as if he was some explorer in the olden times entering some ancient ruin. I met a traveler from an antique land, Jonathan began, remembering a poem that he had learned in high school, about the folly of a king who had wished to leave his legacy upon the world. All that had remained of him thousands of years later had been a pair of weathered feet standing in the middle of the vast desert, showing that such mortal ambitions were pointless. Jonathan smiled, and then walked over to the edge of the tower, peering out at the city itself. The city was about 10 miles wide, and the buildings seemed to be uniformly distributed. He could not see anything of note among the buildings, save for the cathedral in the center. The rest of the city was made up of towers and uniformly constructed buildings, covered in piles of ash. It was a stark, but also strangely beautiful sight, as if he had been the first person to lay eyes on this place in millennia. As Jonathan stood there, savoring the view, he suddenly heard a faint noise coming from the distance and he turned around, looking towards the far horizon. A small cloud of dust was rising up from the north, and it looked to be the product of a large army, heading across the ash. Jonathan instinctively knew that they were coming from him, and he quickly leaped off the tower, landing safely on the ash. He knew that this time, whoever was coming would be ready for him. Jonathan dashed across the city, leaving craters in his wake. He moved at his full speed, crossing the city in a few minutes, most of which was spent trying to navigate the place. He cleared the city a moment after, and was out into the open ash, free and clear. Or so he thought. There was a buzzing hum, and then something landed on the sand in front of him, blasting him backwards. A massive ballista bolt, about 20 feet long, stood vibrating in the ash in front of him. It had come from the air. He looked up, and saw that there was what looked to be a flying ship hovering in the air about a mile above him. It looked like some wooden galleon from the 1700s back on Earth, but it was somehow flying. There was no explanation of the flight, and it simply looked to be a ship floating in midair. Massive ballistas and other projectile weaponry studded its form, and another one was loosed at Jonathan as he stared up at the ship. He took off, zigzagging to avoid the strikes. Jonathan was unable to avoid the sight of the galleon however, and it followed him across the ash, firing off its projectiles at him as it went. The ballista bolts came perilously close to hitting him, and they moved so quickly that he could barely dodge them in time. A few minutes later, he saw a dark speck jump off the side of the ship, and land on the ground a few hundred feet away. It was the shape of a person, and they were clearly quite high level, given the powerful appearance of the armor that they wore. It was made out of some midnight black leather, and was so highly polished that it gleamed in the light. They also wore a black mask, and Jonathan could not tell anything about them. The armor seemed to shift and warp in Jonathan's vision, rendering him unsure of where the wearer actually was. More and more of the black shapes dropped down from the ship, and Jonathan took off running. He could have stayed and tested his luck, but there was no reason to do so. He spared a glance behind himself, and saw that the figures were coming in hot pursuit, and they were moving quite quickly. One of them lobbed something at him, and he swerved to the right as it came in, dodging the attack. The object landed a few dozen feet away from him, and exploded, turning the ash to glass with its heat. Jonathan whistled, and kept swerving, now having to worry about both the attacks from the ship and from his pursuers. There was no shelter in sight, and Jonathan wasn't sure where he was going to go to escape from this situation. It wasn't looking good. His stamina bar was starting to drop, and it was edging closer to halfway full. Jonathan took a few deep breaths and kept running, focusing on his movements. Behind him, his pursuers did not flag, running after him as if they were on a simple morning jog. They were clearly specialists in dexterity, given their speed and the armor that they were wearing. It looked as if he was being chased down by some sort of assassin group. Jonathan was starting to feel the exertion by now, and if it went on like this, he would have to add some points to dexterity. It was comforting to know that he had the option though. Jonathan would have been able to fight his opponents if not for the ship hovering above, proving ranged support. One of those tree-like ballista bolts would seriously injure him. Jonathan began to slow down as he continued running, and the gap between him and his pursuers was slowly narrowing. At this rate he was going to be caught. With a sigh, Jonathan placed 18 points into strength and dexterity, boosting both his speed and stamina significantly. With his multipliers, it was as if he had placed 30 points into each stat. His footsteps suddenly began to pick up, and he felt a new well of energy burgeon inside him, fueling his movements. Jonathan let out a whoop of delight and started to accelerate, leaving his assailants behind him. However, this was not to last. He was still in the middle of nowhere, with nowhere to run to and nowhere to hide. He was able to evade his pursuers for now, but such a feat would not last forever. He would eventually tire, and then would be caught. Jonathan gritted his teeth and moved faster, trying to force his body to use every last bit of his stamina that he could. It felt like he was trying to lift a mountain with his bare hands, but he was able to eke out a little bit more than he normally would have been able to. As it turned out though, this was all for naught. A different sort of projectile slammed down into the ground in front of him, this time not a ballista bolt. It was a glass orb filled with some sort of murky solution, and when it burst, it sent out a billowing cloud of noxious gas that went straight into Jonathan's pores, corrupting his body. Jonathan gasped in shock and pain as the poison began to spread through his system, and he slowed down, stumbling as he tried to move. Behind him, the black-clad figures were beginning to catch up again, and he turned around desperately, trying to muster a defense against them. However, he began to fall, and then darkness claimed him. Jonathan climbed back out of the dark abyss some time later, groaning as the mother of all headaches racked his body. He was lying on a smooth wooden floor, and he was wearing some sort of strange bracelet on his right hand that pulsed regularly with a gentle blue light. He tried to access his mana to light up the room around him, but nothing happened. The blue band pulsed brighter for a moment, and then went back to normal. It seemed that it was inhibiting his mana. Jonathan got to his feet, and looked around the room, trying to figure out where he was. The gentle rocking sensation from the world around him told him that he was on the flying ship that had been chasing him down earlier. Jonathan shook his head in exasperation, and tried to find a door. It looked as if he had been sealed in here somehow, and he was missing all of his armor, his weapons, and his storage device. Jonathan growled low in his throat as he examined his predicament. He had been utterly defeated. At least he was not dead. He could always escape late on, but if he had died, then it would be over. It seemed that Granath or whoever was in control here was eager to gloat over their victory over Jonathan. "You fool! You will never get out of there with your brute power alone. You are welcome to try though." The voice of the man outside was nasally, arrogant, and high-pitched, which instantly made Jonathan dislike the man, not that he was particularly inclined to anyone on this ship in the first place. He could have easily unbound the spell if he had access to his mana, but he did not. Jonathan reached down to the band on his wrist and tried to pull it off, but he could feel the bracelet drawing on his mana pool, sucking it out to reinforce itself. It was a clever piece of craftsmanship, and Jonathan could not help but be impressed by it. He sat down, out of ideas, and tried to connect to his mana. It was as if there was a solid steel wall between him and his power though, and he was completely unable to even get the smallest speck of light to appear in front of him. The bracelet was too powerful for even him to deal with. However, he had another trick up his sleeve, which was the power of the void. He had used it mostly to accentuate his mana, but he knew that it was something separate entirely, given by the mastery bar on his stat sheet. He was still at 1%, which meant that he still had a long journey in front of him. He could feel a tight core of purple energy deep within him, but it felt removed, not because of the bracelet, but simply because he had never tried to access it before. He could feel a profound connection to it however, greater than any he had felt before. Jonathan closed his eyes, and sent his awareness to the orb of purple light, trying to get it to respond to his will. As he grew closer and closer to it in his metaphysical sight, he noticed that it was only the tiniest fraction of a near-infinite well of power. The amount that he could see was small enough, but the amount that he could feel in the corner of his mind was mind-bogglingly immense. It was as if he was looking at the house-sized top of a planet-sized iceberg. It was a majestic sight, at least with the context that he could feel in the back of his mind. If not for the thought of the massive well of power lurking behind this tiny front, it would have simply seemed like his mana or some other banal power. Instead, he could now feel more of the void within himself, and he reached out to it, beckoning for its embrace. The purple light started to flicker, and a tiny purple flame drifted towards him. From off the orb, hovering over his hand. It had no heat to it, but it felt as if it had near infinite destructive potential. Jonathan returned to the outside world, and saw that a tiny flickering flame hovered above his palm, glowing with a surreal purple light. He smiled, and moved it towards the mana-inhibiting bracelet. As it made contact, the bracelet sizzled, and the flame went out. The bracelet looked almost unchanged, but Jonathan saw that a tiny portion of it had melted, but had since recooled. However, he had certainly made a dent in it. Jonathan smiled, and he knew that he now had a way out. Over the next few hours, he worked on improving his control over the void, and managed to increase his mastery to 2% by doing so. The flames became slightly larger, and the bracelet was beginning to warp under the strain. There was no heat to the fire, so it did not burn his hand, but the bracelet acted as if it was being slowly eaten away by something. Nobody came to bother him, either under orders not to disturb him, or because they were too afraid to come into an enclosed space with him. His assailants had known that they wouldn't have been able to defeat him in an honest battle, and they had resorted to using poison instead. At least, he flattered his own ego by thinking that was the reason. In any case, it hardly mattered. He was in this predicament one way or another, and it was his utmost imperative to escape it as quickly as he could. However, he had no idea what he was supposed to do. He was in a flying ship, and doubted that he would be able to simply waltz up to the top and jump over the edge. No, somebody would stop him before that. He would have to wait and bide his time until he had an opportunity to escape. Jonathan kept at it, gradually weakening his bracelet until it had been cut entirely through on one side, and the mana-dampening effects were mostly gone. However, he knew that he could not simply break free now. The ship was likely to have many powerful foes on it. Foes that Jonathan would not be able to defeat without the aid of his armor and weapons. A good portion of his durability and combat prowess came from his armor and his gauntlets, and despite the fact that he was probably stronger than anyone on this ship, there were far more of them, and they might have more of that toxic gas that they had used on him before. He did not know what had been in that stuff, but it had been potent enough to knock him out in a matter of seconds. Perhaps that was a way of bypassing the system-mandated laws against Circle Lords fighting those who were far weaker than themselves, in that they could simply send high-leveled armaments to their lackeys for them to use in their stead. Nothing seemed to be entirely fair in this new world, and Jonathan was sure that was the reason behind it. Jonathan hid the torn part of the bracelet in his sleeve, making it appear that it was in the same shape as before. He had managed to render it impotent, and his greatest weapon in the coming hours would be ensuring that the enemy thought he was powerless. Well, he still possessed his strength, but as shown before, there were many ways of negating the effects of that with ease. He was sure that enough strength would have allowed him to overload the defenses, perhaps with the addition of all of his remaining stat points, but then he would be in uncertain territory, no better off than before. Jonathan waited for a bit, with nothing better to do with his time than explore his capacity for the void. The well of elemental energy within him was not going anywhere anytime soon, and it was always available for him to study. The power of the void was fascinating in its depth, and despite its one overarching quality which was the destruction of everything not related to itself, it possessed incredible depth in the breadth of its concept. Some time later, perhaps over a day, the ship began to descend, and Jonathan jerked back to full awareness. He had reached 3% mastery over his element, which was welcome. The descent was gradual, but it was certainly there, and Jonathan got to his feet. As soon as he did so, the same gas from before started to filter in through holes forming in the side of the room, poisoning Jonathan. As he collapsed to the floor, he made sure that his bracelet was hidden. Shadowy figures entered the room as he fell unconscious, picking him up and carrying him off somewhere unknown. However, Jonathan was already asleep by that point. A raucous cacophony of noise brought him back to his senses, and Jonathan jerked back to awareness, finding himself chained to a metal post in the middle of a sandy arena. He was surrounded by thousands of spectators, all peering eagerly down at him from on high. They sat on weathered stone stands that stretched up hundreds of feet into the air, with ample room for all the people present. An anxious hubbub rose up from their number, and Jonathan caught a few words here and there, none of which were very encouraging. Most of them were along the lines of evil and murderer. There was no doubt who they were talking about. Up above him, 9 figures sat on a raised dais, wearing what looked to be the regalia of judges. They were hooded, and he could not make out their features, but they all gave out an aura of refined power that caused Jonathan to inadvertently shiver. The bracelet was still on his wrist, but it was still thankfully inert, and he was able to access his mana at any time that he wanted to. Behind the arena, he could see the tops of hundreds of buildings, which meant that he was probably in the capital of the ash heaps. If he managed to escape from here, he would have an entire city to traverse. At least he would be able to get a look at his enemy's stronghold. We are gathered today to witness the trial and punishment of the rebel known as Jonathan Harlow. The central member of the hooded figure said, rising to her feet. Around her, the others rose also. He stands accused of many counts of crimes against the realms and against the will of our overseer, Lord Granath. For these crimes, the accused is only fit for one punishment: death. In 3 hours, the Lord himself will be here to pass judgment on this scum you see before you. Jonathan wasn't exactly sure how a courtroom worked, but he was pretty sure that this was not it. He was supposed to have some sort of lawyer to defend him, but he supposed that this was all for show anyway. The verdict would be the same no matter what. Death. Death. The crowd began to chant, their voices mingling into a harmonious note that would have been quite beautiful if not for the context. The judge pointed her slender finger at Jonathan, and the sand around him collapsed, causing him to fall down into a dark hole, flailing wildly as he did so. The chains and the post detached from him, and he landed a few seconds later, grunting as he bent his knees reflexively. The fall had only been about 100 feet, and he hadn't even lost a single health point. He was standing in a pitch-black room, without a single speck of light with which to see. Above him, the gap in the arena floor closed up, extending down to about 2 feet above his head, and he was left standing there in utter blackness. After making sure that there was nobody around, he summoned a ball of mana to his hand, casting his surroundings in a soft purple glow. He was in a tiny room, barely 6 feet wide. There was no door, simply smooth stone, etched with words that glowed faintly with power. Jonathan ran his fingers along one of them, and felt a slight jolt as mana leaped towards his skin from the inscription. The words glowed a bright blue for a second, revealing what they were. They were of no language that Jonathan could understand, and seemed to have no meaning, seeing as his system interface normally translated everything that he saw. It was probably something like the glyphs that he had seen in the abandoned city, a means of channeling the power of mana to more sophisticated ends. In that vein, Jonathan now had access to his mana again, and he would be damned if he did not use it to its fullest to escape from this place. His normal skills were not going to cut it here. He would need to step up his game in terms of mana manipulation abilities. Jonathan summoned a bright ball of mana to his hands, and focused on trying to warp it into different shapes. Because of the way that his mana manipulation abilities worked and improved, he would need to do some experimentation first. The mana was still tinted with purple light, meaning that the power of the void was very much present in there. It seemed to be a little more potent than before, perhaps from his practice on the flying ship. Jonathan started off by testing the strength of the walls around him by thrusting the mana into the wall. It bubbled somewhat, and melted around the ball, but it did not evaporate like most materials would. With enough time, he would eventually be able to escape, but that was time that he did not have. Instead, Jonathan withdrew his hands, and focused on trying to improve the destructive capabilities of his mana orbs. Right now, they were about 6 inches wide, and glowed like a bright fire. He would need to compress it further in order to gain more power out of it. Jonathan sent his will into the mana channels in his hand, tugging on the mana construct on his palm through them, and condensing it. He made sure that none of the mana escaped, and the ball slowly began to grow smaller and smaller until it was about half the size as before. He had done things like this before, but it had always been within a few seconds of an attack, and he had not been forced to hold it for long. Jonathan was starting to feel the strain as he focused on his mana ball, and it was trying to escape from his grip. Jonathan tightened his will down onto the orb, and continued, using every ounce of his willpower to crush it into the smallest shape that he could make it. Eventually, he managed to get it down to about an inch, where it was actually painful to hold in place. Jonathan grunted, and sunk his fist into the wall. The ball of mana ate right through the stone like it was made out of butter, but the only problem was that the area of effect was much smaller than before. Jonathan used the orb like a plasma torch, basting the wall in its glow. Eventually, the strain became too much, and the orb exploded, blasting chunks out of the rock. Jonathan was sent off his feet and into the other wall. He sighed, and pushed himself back to standing, knowing that his time was running out here. He only had a few hours to escape this place, before Granath himself came to judge him. He would need to get out of here before then. Jonathan stepped up the difficulty, drawing mana to both of his fists at once. His hands glowed with purple light as he condensed the orbs, managing to get them both down to around 2 inches. He moved over to the wall, and started to tear into it with his mana, carving out a large hole in the side. He was able to keep this up for about a minute, and with his enhanced speed, he had managed to carve about 3 feet into the wall, with about 4 feet of width. He could get out through this if he needed to, but it would be a bit of a tight fit. He was not exactly a small man, not since coming to this world. Jonathan took a step backwards and surveyed his work. He had made progress, but he had no idea how much further there was to go. He would need to alter his technique from here on out. Jonathan focused on one palm, and began to create an orb of mana there, but rather than condensing it, he tried to draw it out into a bar-like shape, extending it into a rectangle. The orb started to twist, and Jonathan strained to bend it to his will. However, mana seemed to have an ideal shape in mind, which was that of the sphere. He would be able to alter it, but it would be extremely difficult. He managed to turn it into a cube first, and then started to elongate it with his willpower, eventually turning it into a stocky rectangle that was about twice as long as it was wide. This way, he would be able to affect more surface area with his technique. Jonathan pressed the rectangle to the side of the hole, and found that it was able to cut through it with a degree of ease, about halfway in between the effects of his uncondensed sphere and the condensed one. It was more effective than both in any case. Jonathan used it to carve around the circle of rock, and dug a smooth channel about a foot into the sides of the wall. He then withdrew his hand, and carved out a crude handle into the front of the rock face. Digging his right palm into the side of the wall back in the room, he started to pull. He pulled with all of his might, sending pain shooting through his body. His arm felt like it was being torn off, but he kept at it. Eventually, there was a resounding crack, and the chunk of rock broke free, causing him to stumble backwards from the redirected force. The wall was cracked around the place where he had pulled, and the tunnel had been extended slightly. Jonathan kept at this for the next 30 minutes, managing to dig almost 10 feet into the wall, and as he did so, he finally broke through to the other side of the wall. There was another room over there, and it was occupied. Jonathan could hear someone panting in exertion as they battered the wall in front of themselves with their fists. As Jonathan broke through, the noise stopped, and heard the whistle of air from a high-speed attack. Jonathan instantly moved backwards, just as a fist impacted the place where his hand had been. "Hey! We're not enemies. I am a prisoner here too," Jonathan said, trying to placate the stranger. "You two fight the despicable forces of Granath?" The other person said, in a deep voice. His inflection was odd, and he seemed to be quite articulate in his diction. Yes. Were you put here because of that too? My name is Jonathan. Jonathan Harlow. Well met, Jonathan. I am, or rather was, Prince Edgar of the Halconian Kingdom. That was back in the world of the living, however. Now I am simply Edgar Lackland, a fallen noble. I could not rest while such a foul creature ruled this land, and I started a campaign against him. As fortune would have it, however, nobody joined me, and I was quietly caught. I am due to be executed later this day. Despite his predicament, Edgar seemed to be resilient in the face of his fate, and his voice did not tremble. This was not some hothouse noble, but a warrior through and through. The same is due for me. I am trying to break out of here. Do you remember anything from when you were put here? Jonathan asked Edgar. I was wondering how you managed to break that wall. You are only around my level, yet you seem to be a bit stronger. How did you manage to break that accursed bracelet? Such things were unknown to me back in Telvaria. I used my elemental abilities. It took a while though. I will be able to spring you loose, but I can't do it now. We need to focus on escaping. Elemental abilities. That was one of the first things that I tried. How in the name of the light did you dash? Edgar began, before Jonathan hushed him. Not now. We are wasting time here. He said this both to save time, as he had stated, but mainly because he didn't want to tell the other man about his void abilities. He had a feeling that would be foolish indeed. Very well. How do you plan to escape this place though? Edgar replied. When I fell down here, most of the layers above us were made out of sand. It was kept in place by some magical field, but it should be easy enough to go through if we can reach it. You mean to escape through the arena? That seems rash, even to me, a man of great bravery. Jonathan gave him a look, but he seemed to be speaking seriously. He shook his head, and then pointed at the ceiling. If you hold me up there, I can start to carve out a hole. Edgar nodded, and he boosted Jonathan up on his hands, using them as footholds for Jonathan to stand on. Jonathan nodded at the man in thanks and got to work, starting to carve into the rock above with his void-enhanced mana. He shaved off large chunks, using the vertical alignment of the rock to use gravity against it, causing chunks to fall down. A few of them hit Edgar, but the man didn't seem to mind. As Jonathan excavated enough space for him to place his entire upper body, he began to carve out handholds for himself and Edgar to use. He hoisted himself up by one hand, and kept working, using his prodigious strength to hold himself steady. Jonathan slowly worked his way up, until he ran out of mana, about 10 feet up. Below him, Edgar had started to climb up too, and the man frowned when he saw that Jonathan had stopped. What seems to be the matter, Jonathan? He asked, in his curious manner of speaking. If anything, it reminded Jonathan of the way that some people at Renaissance fairs spoke, which he supposed made sense, seeing as Edgar had come from a medieval kingdom. I need to wait for my mana to recharge. This is quite tough going, Jonathan replied. I am sure that it is. You are carving through stone that even I was unable to do more than crack with my full strength. You must be some sort of prodigy in the realm of mana. I remember my brother. You remind me of him. Sensing that he might as well get to know his unexpected ally a bit better, Jonathan answered him. Really? In what way? He was always proactive, and did whatever it took to get what he wanted. He died some time ago, and I hope that his soul is enjoying its eternal rest in the heavens above. Oh, I'm sorry, Jonathan replied, a little awkwardly. Thank you for the kind words. However, that was long ago, and I am sure that he would not want anything to do with me now, blasphemer that I am. Blasphemer? I was sent to the hells because of my stance on the matter of the gods' interference in the mortal realms. I would have thought that such powerful beings would be unconcerned about the words of a mere Tier 1 prince, but it seems that their pettiness runs as deep as their potency. Jonathan raised an eyebrow, but did not say anything. It seemed from his experience that many people within the hells had lost their faith in the time that they had spent in this realm, which made sense. It was pretty hard to believe in gods that had sent you to hell for some petty matter. Quite a few of the people here were not here for anything that was truly evil, simply because they had offended the gods in some way. If Jonathan even got out of here, the gods would be next on his list, not last because of this, but rather because they had killed him. Such a slight could not go unpunished, not that it was really a slight, more of an unforgivable offense. The fact that he was still alive, at least in some capacity, was no excuse. Jonathan realized that Edgar was staring at him, as he had been looking off at the wall for almost half a minute without speaking. "Jonathan? What plagues you now?" "Nothing, just some memories. It isn't anything important." The other man gave him a look, but then nodded, and let Jonathan get back to work. Jonathan started to use his mana bar once more, and he continued climbing upwards, excavating the rock and stone above him. Some time later, his hand broke through a thin layer of rock, and he could feel sand above him. They had finally reached the top of the rocky layer. He started to widen the hole, and found that there was some invisible barrier keeping the sand in place. Jonathan frowned, and then sent a fireball of mana upwards, turning the sand to glass, which he then shattered. More sand fell down to fill the gap, and Jonathan shattered it in turn after turning it to glass. It only took up a little bit of mana, and he was no longer in danger of running out. Over the next few minutes, he turned the entire tube of sand above them into a smooth tube of glass, and he levered himself up into it, hitting the sides to create handholds. With a prodigious leap, Jonathan started to climb up the tube, and he reached the top moments later. Edgar was right behind him, and they popped out onto the arena floor within seconds of each other. There was nobody in the stands as of now, and Jonathan could not believe his luck. Perhaps they would be able to get away more easily than they had thought. Then a blaring alarm started to sound over the arena, and guards charged out of the entrances, started to surround the two men. They were all quite powerful, around level 75, and Jonathan did not have the time to stay here and fight. Instead, he raced towards the nearby stands, and started to climb up them, thrusting his hands into the stone. Edgar followed in close pursuit, and the two men narrowly evaded the guards, reaching the tops of the stands. Projectiles started to arc up after them, arrows, bolts of mana, and even a few explosives in one case. Jonathan dealt with the mana bolts, and dodged the other attack. Edgar seemed to be unperturbed by this whole thing, and he kept pace with Jonathan, as they headed towards the exits. The alarm was still going off, and the noise was quite loud, presumably extending out into the city as well. Unless they got out of here quickly, the entire city would come crashing down on them. They reached the top of the arena, using the stands like steps, and then leaped over the edge. Jonathan absent-mindedly hoped that Edgar was durable enough to survive the fall. They fell hundreds of feet to the ground far below, and as they fell, Jonathan got a good look at the city. It sprawled out in every direction, like some vast amoebic slime made out of bricks and dark stone. It was not an especially beautiful city, but its size made it imposing in its own way, and Jonathan could not help but admire it. Flying ships circled overhead, sporadically placed, and the ground teemed with life. He only had a moment to admire all of this, however, before he landed. He landed a few seconds later, creating a crater in the ground. Edgar landed beside him, grunting a little bit, but otherwise unharmed. They started running as soon as they landed, and were down the road in a matter of seconds, drawing curious glances from the passers-by. As they ran, guards spilled out of the entrances to the arena, and the alarm grew louder and louder, until it covered the entire city. A dark cloud rose up from the center of the city, coming from a massive obsidian tower, emblazoned with a 9-pointed circle that seemed to be made out of blood. The two men ducked into a nearby alleyway, and climbed up the sides of the buildings, trying to throw their pursuers. However, the noise of tramping footsteps echoed through the alleyway behind them, and Jonathan noticed a tiny thread of mana connecting Edgar's bracelet to something behind him. "Shit!" he exclaimed, drawing a look from Edgar. What inspires such foul language, Jonathan? We have escaped, after all. They're tracking your bracelet. We need to get it off now, Jonathan said, summoning a concentrated ball of mana to his hand. Now that he had access to his mana again, this would go quite a bit quicker. This might hurt though. Hurt a lot, he warned Edgar. To his credit, the man simply nodded. Jonathan grabbed his hand with his own, and then lowered the mana orb towards the bracelet, starting to cut into it. The bracelet began to melt under the concentrated mana, seeming to be only proof against mana coming from its wearer. Edgar gritted his teeth as the metal burned his hand, but he did not make a sound. A few seconds later, the bracelet had been cut off, and Jonathan tore it off, throwing it backwards. Edgar let out a gasp, and mana suddenly surged back into his form, visible to Jonathan. That feels much better. I can help out a bit more with our escape, Edgar said. Before Jonathan could ask the man what he meant, mana surged around Edgar's form, and a sudden wind picked up around his form, causing his movements to speed up. The wind extended over to Jonathan as well, and he felt his movements increase in speed. A notification appeared in front of him and he read it as he ran. You have been affected by a skill from an ally. Gust of haste. Your speed is increased by a considerable amount while under the effects of this skill and you fall at half the normal rate. It was a very useful effect, and Jonathan would estimate that his speed had increased by about 15%. However, he still was not able to use it fully, as Edgar was slower than him at his top speed, even with the buff. It only meant that he was able to use more of his strength. The two men scrambled along the rooftops and leaped across the gaps between the houses, drawing the eyes of the nearby citizens. The black cloud that had come from the center of the city was spreading across the city now, and it seemed as if it was trying to find them. However, it seemed more aimless than before, as if its tracking effect had been supported by the bracelet. As they ran, Jonathan had an idea, but he wasn't sure whether his companion would appreciate it. Edgar, would you mind if I test something out? Jonathan asked. Depends on what it is, Edgar said, panting slightly. Will it help us escape? If that is the case, then feel free to do so. You have proven to be a trustworthy ally so far. Jonathan gave the man a nod of thanks, and then scooped him up with his arms, placing him on his back. Edgar began to say something, but Jonathan picked up the pace, using his full speed. Buffed by the effects of the skill as he was, Jonathan tore across the city at hundreds of miles per hour, faster than he had been able to reach with Edgar running alongside him. He barely noticed his surroundings as he ran, so fast was he going. Edgar was completely silent, either too scared to speak, or too impressed with Jonathan's speed. In any case, it hardly mattered. They had a city to escape. Have you seen these two men? The man asked, showing her the picture. As soon as the woman saw it, her eyes lit up, and she began to raise her hand to point at Jonathan and Edgar. Swearing, Jonathan rose from his seat rapidly, and raced for the door, Edgar in close pursuit. One of the guards tried to block them, but Jonathan rammed his fist into the man's chest, sending him flying out the door. Cursing the bartender and their luck, Jonathan emerged into the street, only to see dozens of guards combing the road. The two men took off, streaking down the street, as the door behind them burst open, revealing the platoon of guards. They ran after the two men, but the guards were too slow, and they were left in the dust. However, there were more guards up ahead, and they fanned out to block the two fleeing men. Jonathan grunted in annoyance, and forced his way through their ranks, clearing a path for Edgar in the back. The man slammed one palm into the ground as he ran, and a sudden gust of hurricane-force winds blasted the nearby guards backwards. Jonathan raced through the gap and cleared a path in his own way, with his fists and legs. Without his gauntlets, it felt strange for his fist to contact an enemy without anything in between it and his target, but it was almost the same, as his skin was as hard as iron now. He barely felt the impact as it was, and his strikes were more than strong enough to dent metal and drive his foes backwards. He was not able to kill any of them, a testament to their strength, but he was able to force them away from his path, which was all that really mattered in this case. From what he could tell, there was no way that the two of them could remain in the city, as it seemed that there was a picture of them being circulated, and that the citizens would be more than happy to give them up, given by the bartender's expression. There was most likely some sort of reward for their capture. Jonathan gritted his teeth as he tore his way through the guards, who were all coalescing on their spot, drawn by some unknown force. Soon, he would be unable to overpower them through sheer force. This isn't working. They're going to swarm us. He shouted at Edgar, fighting to make his voice heard over the noise of the fray. The sounds of fists on metal and the screams of the wounded were almost too loud to hear anything. However, it seemed that Edgar was able to hear enough, and the man nodded, starting to recharge his mana to strike again, blasting the tightly packed soldiers apart. Edgar leaped over the heads of the reeling fighters, and landed next to Jonathan, sending out another blast of wind towards his nearby enemies. The men were torn off their feet, clearing a small area around them. There seemed to be no end to their ranks, and hundreds of them were streaming this way from all corners of the city, trying to bury them beneath their numbers. They would not be able to defeat them at this rate. I can get us out of here, but I will be useless for about half an hour later. It will take up all of my mana, and quite a bit of my health as well. Is that understood? Do whatever you need to do. It's better than dying. Edgar nodded, and then began to draw in power form the air around him, creating a cloak of swirling wind around his form. The man gritted his teeth, and the cloak extended over to Jonathan, enveloping his form. A moment later, they were in the air, levitating on a cushion of air. They streaked off through the air, borne by solidified wind, and they were quickly dozens of feet above the heads of their enemies, and quickly leaving the area. However, something had changed on the horizon, and a blindingly bright red light was forming on the top of the tower near the center of the city. There was a moment of silence, when all the color in the world seemed to be leached out from the world around them, and then a beam of pure power erupted from the tower, crossing the distance between it and them faster than Jonathan could blink. He desperately angled his body away from the strike, but he was still clipped by the beam, and the energy field around him failed, causing him to plummet to the ground. Edgar was also affected by the attack, and his flight suddenly stopped and he fell with Jonathan. A burning pain tore at Jonathan's side, and he looked down to see that a good-sized chunk of his stomach was missing, cut away smoothly by the beam. A second sun blossomed into being a moment later, rising over the ash like the harbinger of the apocalypse. Far off in the distance, a mushroom cloud of superheated ash rose over the land, the result of the beam hitting something in the desert outside the city. Luckily, Jonathan had been too weak to trigger the effect of the beam, or else he would have died in an instant. The attack had possessed the same power as a nuclear bomb, and Jonathan shivered as he fell, terrified of what sort of being would have that sort of power. He flipped over in the air, and crashed down in the back of a tavern, behind a woodshed. He did not know where the wood had come from, but that was hardly the most pressing concern in his mind at the moment. His wound was bleeding heavily, and it refused to close over, despite his regeneration. At this rate, he would bleed to death. He quickly tore off a strip of his clothes, and bound up the wound, stopping the bleeding for now. His regeneration would do the rest. Edgar landed heavily beside him, wincing as he landed awkwardly on his ankle. A few seconds later, a gust of blistering wind rushed over him, causing him to shield his eyes reflexively. The aftereffects of the beam were still in being, even now. It seemed that there would be no flying from now on. That attack had been completely overkill, and a weaker one would have been able to do the job just as well. They were still mid-tier ones in the city of a peak tier 2 being. Well, Jonathan was probably a bit stronger than that, but he was not anywhere near the peak yet. Anyone who had reached that level would have their own bonuses and titles to bolster their strength. In any case, if this was at all indicative of the later worlds, Jonathan would be in for a wild ride if he made it out of the ash heaps alive. Beside him, Edgar let out a deep breath, and Jonathan looked over at the man, who was shivering slightly. What manner of power have we called down upon ourselves? The man asked, his voice grim. I don't know, but at least we're not dead. We need to get out of this place soon though, or else they might track us down, Jonathan said, starting to move towards the exit. They were standing in what looked to be some sort of walled enclosure for holding various odds and ends from the tavern that stood in front of it. There was a small gate to the side, and Jonathan quickly opened it, revealing a side street that he walked into. There were no other people around, which was good for their purposes, and they quickly ducked out of the place and into the street. This could not go on like this with their faces being known to everyone in the town, and they needed to find some sort of disguise if they were to survive here. Jonathan needed to get his possessions back, not least the book that contained the legacy of the church that had once owned the derelict city out in the wastes, and to do so, they would need to survive long enough to get to it. They padded down the alleyway, trying to remain as inconspicuous as possible. Neither of them possessed anything more than their most basic of clothing items, and as such, they had nothing to disguise themselves with. It was a disconcerting state of affairs, and Jonathan felt very vulnerable indeed, especially when he thought about the vast amount of energy that had been contained within that red beam. He could barely fathom the sort of spell that would have been able to make something like that. He made sure not to get lost in his thoughts however as he was wont to do, and he kept track of Edgar and his surroundings. They were in a human sector of the city now, and they were at least not out of place in terms of race. Jonathan needed to find someplace to get disguises for the two men, which would be quite hard, given that all of their money had been taken by the forces of Granath. As Jonathan walked, he focused on his mana, trying to train it a bit as he moved, wanting to get as much out of this time as he could while there were no monsters to fight. He had no idea how people in a city ever grew stronger, and maybe the simple answer was that they did not. In any case, they were still wasting time here. Jonathan emerged from the alleyway a few minutes later, onto a bustling side street that seemed to be set up as some sort of market. There were hundreds of stalls along its length, and people shouting out their wares at the top of their lungs. All manner of goods were being sold, but most of them seemed like magical items of some kind or another, and Jonathan noticed a nearby shop that was selling portable heat gems for the purpose of cooking with. They looked like flat plates of red crystal that seemed to glow with an inner light. Jonathan had no idea whether they were real or not, but seeing the number of people flocking around that stall, he assumed that they were. In fact, this might be a good place for them to get disguises. Jonathan gave Edgar a look, and the man nodded, understanding what he was getting at immediately. Jonathan and Edgar slunk into the crowd, and let it take them through the market, trying to get a glance at every stall as they passed. Jonathan subtly made it so that the crowd did not move him anywhere that he did not want to go, using his superior strength to remain rooted in place. He did it gently enough that nobody noticed, but it was still effective. Edgar did the same thing, and the two men slowly walked down the street, eyeing up the surrounding vendors. Most of them were useless to their current predicament, and they were all selling various household items that seemed to be made for utility rather than any sort of combat purpose. This was probably just as well, seeing as most of the people here were simply trying to live normal lives. There were no monsters here for them to fight. For someone who had been born into this world, perhaps such a life was all that they knew. Jonathan had been transported here against his will, and as such had been forced to progress through blood and sweat. Perhaps that was not the only way though. However, he would not be changing his path any time soon. As he walked, he eventually spotted a section of the market that was a lot less crowded than the other ones. There was a small black tent in the center of it with nobody standing around it, and he could feel a faint aura of power coming out from the tent. Curious, Jonathan moved through the crowd towards it, making sure not to get sidetracked by the people bustling around him. He was shot more than a few dirty looks from the passers-by, but he ignored them, focusing on his target. The tent was made entirely out of black cloth, and it seemed to be darker than its color would suggest, hiding it from prying eyes. Jonathan broke free of the crowd a moment later, and strode over to the tent, interested to see what was within. Edgar followed him a few paces behind, breaking out of the crowd a moment later. It was like there was an island of silence around the tent, and it was as if the sounds of the crowd were suddenly muffled. If Jonathan was skeptical about the importance of this place before, he was not anymore, and he quickly opened the tent flap, and ducked inside. The interior of the tent was dark, but he could vaguely make out a figure sitting on a chair near the back, poring over a piece of parchment. The room was filled with boxes, and Jonathan had no idea what was within them. "Hello," he called out, trying to get the attention of the person sitting there. The hooded figure simply continued to read their parchment, ignoring Jonathan completely. He walked over, and tapped them on the shoulder, finally causing them to look up. Jonathan instinctively recoiled. It was a human, but an extremely deformed one, missing a nose and indeed most of their face. Jonathan could not tell what gender the person was, nor anything about them really, such as the extent of their deformity. "What do you want?" they hissed, in a voice that was warped and raspy. "Why is your tent surrounded by a ring of emptiness?" "It's like some effect is keeping the passers-by away," Jonathan said. "Why would you want to deprive yourself of possible customers?" "The only customers that I want are those who are powerful enough to break through the warding," the shopkeeper said, grinning slightly, tugging on their many scars. "People like you. I can give you all manner of illicit goods, and any of them are yours, for the right price, of course." "And what is the right price?" Edgar interjected. "Oh, you'll know when you see it," the figure said, grinning uncomfortably through their distorted flesh. "Well, do you sell any sort of disguises?" "We are in trouble with someone, and we need to be able to hide ourselves from them," Jonathan said, trying to be as vague as possible. He did not know whether this person would refuse to serve them, or perhaps even report them, if they said that they were trying to evade the servants of Granath. "In trouble with the law, are you?" the figure said, grinning once more. "I know your kind. People who have still not realized that Granath is paramount in these lands, and still try to fight him. Now, I won't begrudge you that, as business is business." Jonathan gritted his teeth, but remained outwardly stoic. If this person had come to that conclusion so easily, then they would have already reported them to the authorities, or would have threatened to do so. However, it seemed like they were eager enough to sell to them instead. "Is there any reason why you aren't trying to threaten us with that knowledge?" Jonathan asked the vendor, trying to keep his voice calm. "Who's to say that I won't?" the shopkeeper said, beginning to laugh. Jonathan's eyes glittered with purple light, and his aura came out, pressing itself like a naked blade to the shopkeeper's throat. The person suddenly gurgled, and froze, looking at Jonathan in a new light. "I am not in the mood for games," Jonathan said, sending his power into his voice. As a result, it was far deeper and louder than normal. His aura withdrew a moment later, leaving the shopkeeper gasping. "What are you?" "That elemental power is like none I have ever seen before." Jonathan cocked his head threateningly, and the shopkeeper raised their hands rapidly. All right. Not another word. However, I assure you that you want to know why I have not already betrayed you like the rest of the people in this city would? Why would you make such assumptions about the character of the citizens?" Edgar asked. "There are bound to be some good people out there, people who yearn for freedom." "Oh, yearn they certainly do. However, all of the people in this city are soul-bound to Granath. One of his many perversions of the magical arts. I only escaped because of my unique talents." "Talents such as?" Jonathan asked, trying to keep the surprise of his face. That bit of information about the soul binding sounded like something that would be suspicious not to know, far more suspicious than being on the wrong side of the law. "I have a rare hereditary class called Dark Merchant. It allows me to evade most forms of surveillance as long as my wares are sufficiently illicit. It comes with other bonuses as well, but you hardly need to know those now, do you?" Jonathan scanned the shopkeeper, but nothing happened. They were completely shielded from his sight. "You just tried to scan me, did you not? Well, I guess you just found out about another one of my talents. Now, if this foreplay is over, then can we get down to business? Jonathan and Edgar nodded, and the shopkeeper snapped their fingers, causing the various boxes around the room to suddenly open, revealing a wide array of various sinister-looking goods. The nearest box was filled with hundreds of bones of various sizes and provenances, some of which were an unearthly shade of black. These were clearly not the items that they were seeking, so Jonathan and Edgar moved on. The next box contained a dozen amulets, each of which veritably vibrated with dark potency. Jonathan reached out towards one of them, but he thought better of it after the object started to crackle with dark lightning. Jonathan scanned one of the amulets, interested in what would produce such a result. Cursed Amulet of Warding. Tier 1 Magical Item. This amulet was originally intended to be a powerful charm of warding, but its maker made an error in its creation, and it now wards against all threats, even its would-be wearer. This item is functionally useless, save for use against thieves. Jonathan raised an eyebrow, and kept going, as the item was entirely useless to him, and indeed everyone else. He didn't bother to check on the other amulets, as they all had the same magical signature as the original one. The next box seemed more promising, containing a large wand made out of dark metal. It had a foreboding aura, and Jonathan quickly scanned it. Basic Wand of Elemental Focus. Tier 1 Magical Item. This wand contains small traces of the 12 basic elements within it, contained within a magically charged matrix of dark iron. Using it as a casting focus will increase the wielder's control of their element by a small amount. Jonathan was tempted by the item, but he then realized that it was not a weapon that would be useful for long, as it did not possess the ability to rank up, unlike his gauntlets and armor, which he would eventually reclaim. Besides, he was already stumped with what to pay the merchant with, and he didn't want to add to that bill. Jonathan kept moving, looking around for something that would work as a disguise. Eventually, Edgar found something on the other side of the tent, hailing Jonathan loudly. Jonathan turned around and followed his voice, heading towards the man. "Look at these," Edgar said. "These might be just what we're looking for." Joanchen looked into the box that Edgar was pointing at, seeing a few masks scattered around the bottom of the box. Jonathan quickly scanned the objects, smiling as he did so. Basic Mask of the Unseen. Tier 1 Magical Item. A mask made in the pattern of a famous rogue from the lower worlds of the infinite hells. It is able to disguise the wearer to a limited degree, and conceal that presence to a greater degree. When wearing this mask, there is a constant mana price of 10 points per second, which, if not met, will be taken from stamina, and then from health. While under the effect of the mask, you assume a different persona, but those who are perceptive enough can realize that something is wrong. That is where the other effect comes into play. The mask extends an aura of obfuscation around your person, causing others to forget your presence, even when you are standing in front of them. This feature can be supercharged by increasing the mana tithe. None of these effects work if you engage in combat with another, however. Jonathan grinned, and dropped his skill, looking up at Edgar in glee. "This is exactly what we need," he said, prompting the merchant to come over to them. The merchant was rubbing their hands together in expectation of a good deal. "So, are you gentlemen interested in a pair of these masks?" the merchant asked. "We are." "How much will this cost?" "I have to admit, I do not have any marks on me at the moment," Jonathan confessed. "That is perfectly all right. I don't deal in mundane currency in any case. I charge in mana. Each of those masks will be 2,500 mana, paid into this orb here." The shopkeeper pointed towards a glowing glass orb attached to their belt, and Jonathan frowned. 2,500 mana. How exactly would that work? You simply place one hand on the orb, and it will draw the mana out of you. However, there is a catch. If you do not possess enough mana, it will start to drain your stamina and health, until it gets the requisite 2,500 points of energy. I've seen quite a few people meet nasty ends at the hands of this device over the years. Jonathan nodded, and quickly scanned the mana orb, not trusting the shopkeeper enough to simply heed their words blindly. Mana Transfer Orb. Tier 1 Magical Item. This orb can take mana out of one being and transfer it into its storage, allowing for it to be taken out at a later date by its owner. Using this orb will take up the preset amount of mana, digging into health and stamina if the amount is not met. Jonathan could sense something hidden behind the status window however, and he narrowed his eyes, forcing divinity into his scanning skill. The next time he read the description, it was very different. Cursed Mana Transfer Orb. Tier 1 Magical Item. This orb can take mana out of one being and transfer it into its storage, allowing for it to be taken out at a later date by its owner. Using this orb will take up the preset amount of mana, digging into health and stamina if the amount is not met. However, this orb was intentionally cursed by a powerful mage, and now takes as much mana, health and stamina as is within the body of its user, killing them. Jonathan gritted his teeth, and looked up at the shopkeeper, who suddenly realized that something was wrong. However, it was too late. Jonathan summoned his mana to his right hand, and concentrated it into a sword of light that glowed with a deep purple aura. He swiped his hand across the air, and a moment later, the shopkeeper's head came tumbling down, bouncing off the floor. A second later their body fell too, and the objects around them started to disappear. A few Leviathan marks clattered to the ground from the shopkeeper's pockets, as the body disappeared, and Edgar quickly scooped them up. Jonathan hurriedly picked up two of the masks, and raced over to the elemental wand, picking it up too before it could disappear. Luckily, the objects that he had claimed did not fade away. He handed over one of the masks to Edgar, and both men put them on, just before the tent disappeared around them, revealing them to the gaze of the outside world. However, nobody paid them any heed, and Jonathan let out a sigh of relief. The masks were working as intended. There were 2 new notifications waiting for him, both for skills. You have gained a new skill. Mana Saber Rare. Use your mana to create a crude sword of energy that can be used for simple tasks. The other one was more exciting however. You have upgraded one of your skills. Identify, Common-Basic True Sight, Legendary. You can empower your sight with the energy of your divinity, revealing all hidden effects within the area around you, up to a certain amount of power. It was basically something that he had already been able to do, but now he had gained a skill for it, which meant that he would be able to do it more efficiently. In addition, it was legendary, which was always nice to see. With these new bonuses, as well as the masks, their time within the city would be far less dangerous than before unless they ran into someone of sufficient strength to see through their disguises. In any case, they were ready to start their quest to regain their lost possessions. A few hours later, both men were sitting in the middle of a crowded tavern, unnoticed because of their masks. They were surrounded by people who could report them at any moment, but none of them had. The 2 men had tested their masks on everyone that they had met, and found that their effects were quite strong indeed. When any of the city guards came around, they had to increase the effects with an extra injection of mana, but such a measure ensured that they were let alone before long. Jonathan took a contemplative sip of his tankard of beer, musing over its taste. It was strange, seeing as there were no hops in this world, and the taste was not the same as beer back on Earth. However, it was certainly refreshing, and it still had alcohol in it, not that it was able to affect Jonathan at all. Judging by the raucous shouting coming from the rest of the tavern however, it was certainly having an effect on the lower-level citizens. The overall strength of the beer was far more than it would have been back on Earth, more akin to whiskey or vodka in strength than anything else. It was needed to get through the supernatural durability of the citizens however. In any case, Jonathan was having quite a good time, being able to relax somewhat for the first time since coming to his world in a while. He had a new friend with him, and the 2 men were rapidly getting to know one another better. So, Edgar, you said that you never managed to see any of the great sights of Telvaria during your time there? Like I said, I was only a peasant there, so I was not able to witness anything other than a few adventurers coming by here and there. I wonder why you weren't stronger, if you were there for most of your life, and you were in a position of power. Jonathan said, interested in why so many people seemed to be far weaker than they should have been, given the amount of time that it had taken Jonathan to reach his current level of strength. Progression in Telvaria is very much a business. Most of the planet's surface has at least some sapient presence, and all of the monsters' lairs are mapped out, to be plundered by adventurers. At least, that is how it is at the lower levels. I have no idea about the situation within the higher-leveled areas, Edgar replied, looking a bit abashed at this declaration of his ignorance. Well, at least your progression is freer here. You can do whatever you want, get as strong as you've ever dreamed of. That is true, but is that freedom worth being in hell? After all, our journey is bound to end sometime soon, with our rebellion against Granath. Do you honestly believe that you can actually beat that beast? Because, before long, we're either going to be dead in a ditch somewhere, or facing off against the king of this circle. Jonathan nodded pensively at this, and mulled over his drink, not really thinking about much in particular. It had been a while since he could simply sit down and unwind, relaxing in a public place. There were some benefits to being in this city, it seemed. A sudden thought entered Jonathan's mind, and he almost let it overtake him. What if he remained here, and never fought again, living as a normal citizen for the rest of his life? It wasn't exactly paradise, but it was still a life. The part of him that had sworn vengeance against the gods upon arriving here stirred, however, and the desire vanished like mist in the morning sun. Jonathan clenched his fist, shattering the tankard involuntarily. Everyone around him looked over, but he merely fed more mana into his mask, causing them to go back to their previous tasks. These masks really were quite powerful. It was a pity that their protection vanished when one fought another, and Jonathan imagined the power that he would wield if his enemies forgot they were even fighting him during their battles, but he eventually decided that the benefits were good enough as they were. He looked up at Edgar, ready to be castigated, but the man simply sipped on his drink, rather than saying anything. Jonathan sighed, and looked down at the mess that was on his table. Sorry about that. I have some pent-up anger at the people who sent me here, Jonathan said. I suppose that's true. I was never expecting to hear something like that in the hells. I was expecting for my journey to be a long and lonely one. Well, so was I. Now, however, we can at least fight and die together, rather than apart, Edgar replied, in a somewhat melancholy tone. The man had already resigned himself to his death, and seemed to be happy about it. Jonathan was not quite there yet, but he was sure of just how ridiculous his quest was, and that the chances of him ever finishing it were basically zero. Jonathan finished off his drink, and then got up, weaving his way through the crowd. It was getting close to dark outside, and he wanted to check on the light outside. They were planning to infiltrate the storage facility during the dark, rather than during the day, so as to have as much cover as possible. Outside, the light was almost gone, and the dusky hue of the night was stealing over the clouds. Jonathan nodded, and then walked back into the tavern, signaling for Edgar to come out. The other man left his drink and quickly exited the tavern, reaching Jonathan's side a few seconds later. Neither man spoke, already knowing what it was that they needed to do. As the streets cleared of people, as they headed off for the night, Jonathan and Edgar raced down the streets towards the city center. Their possessions were sure to be found in the central storage facility of the city, and the two men ran as quickly as they could without attracting too much attention, flitting down the road like ghosts in the night. With the effects of their masks, they were practically the same thing, and nobody noticed them at all. The streets of the city were vast and winding, however, and it took them a lot longer than they had expected to head for the center. The sector of the city that they had been in was almost 50 miles away from the city center, which meant that all of the landmarks that the two men had seen earlier must have been truly massive. The men made sure to avoid the wandering patrols of guards, just in case any of them could see through their disguise. In that way, they managed to make their way to their destination safely, and they eventually arrived on the outskirts of the city center, immediately met with a problem. There was a massive wall separating the central part of the city from the rest, and the wall was heavily guarded, with hundreds of guards patrolling the top of the wall. There was only one way in, a massive iron gate that even Jonathan would have been hard-pressed to break down. It was covered in hundreds of glyphs, presumably to render it even more impenetrable than it already was. The walls were completely smooth too, with nowhere that anyone could get a handhold, no matter how small. Jonathan paused, and looked up at the imposing edifice, which stretched over 100 feet into the sky. This might be a problem. There was a rumbling noise a few seconds later, and the gate began to creak up, revealing the feet of a patrol of guards heading out into the night. Jonathan and Edgar ducked behind a nearby building, and watched the procession go by. Perhaps, if there was enough time, they could sneak in after the guards and get through the gate that way. However, as soon as the last of the guards departed, the gate slammed down, far faster than mere gravity would have dictated, sealing off the entrance. It would not be that easy, it seemed. Jonathan sighed, and turned to Edgar. "Any ideas?" he asked. "That gate looks like it's enchanted to provide as much security as it can muster. However, did you see any guards controlling the gate? The wall is too thin to have any sort of portcullis or anyone meaning it. As far as I can see, the thing is completely automated, and operates on a set of controls. Perhaps we can trick it." As if in answer to his question, a wandering troop of guards turned the corner, and headed towards the gate. As they neared, the gate began to slowly open, letting the guards in. It slammed shut a moment later, but Jonathan already had an idea. "Wait there," he said to Edgar, racing off into the streets. The other man watched him go and then resumed watching the gates. Edgar was not used to being around people stronger than himself, as his position within his old kingdom had necessitated his being the most powerful in any given area. However, Jonathan was proving to be a great ally and a valuable friend. Edgar had never really possessed anything along the lines of a friend back in Telveria. He had always been too busy, and too far removed from the rest of the world to have anything of the sort. As Edgar watched the gate, Jonathan was hunting down a small pack of guards, and he overtook them in an alleyway, knocking them out and stealing their armor. In the dark, none of them would have recognized his face, especially with his mask, so he should be safe. Jonathan took 2 suits of armor under each hand, and then raced back towards the gate, ready to present his find to Edgar. As he ran, Jonathan stuck to the back alleyways. His mask might have been able to protect against general scrutiny, but most people would be hard-pressed to ignore a man carrying 2 suits of armor at this hour. He neared the wall a few minutes later, and headed for the alleyway where Edgar was waiting. Jonathan set down one of the suits of armor, and started to don the other one, watching as Edgar put on his own one. The 2 men soon were dressed in the attire of a city guard, and they both inspected one another, trying to see whether they would blend in. Luckily, most of the armor pieces fitted well, and it didn't look too suspicious. They kept the masks on under the helmets, glad for the little bit of extra space there that allowed for them to keep the obfuscating aspect of the masks active. Combined with their armor, nobody would suspect them at all. As another patrol came by, Jonathan and Edgar dashed out from behind the alleyway edge. They remained as silent as possible, given that they were wearing full-plate armor, and they found their place in the back of the array of soldiers, not drawing any attention because of their masks. As the first of the soldiers walked through the rapidly opening gate, Jonathan and Edgar gave each other a look. They had made it. As they stepped through the gate, it slammed shut behind them, causing their ears to ring. The gate was almost 5 feet thick, and made entirely out of metal. It was a gate that could stop almost anything in the world, save for that attack that had been leveled at them from the Dark Tower. Speaking of that tower, it was clearly visible from behind the roofs of the many mansions that lined the streets. It seemed that the closest servants of Granath reaped some benefit from their servitude. Houses that would not have looked out of place on some billionaire's row back on Earth jostled for attention within the walled city, and the area was heavily patrolled by guards, likely ensuring the safety of their wealthy charges. In the very center was a titanic palace, which was visible even from here. The entire complex was about 10 miles across, and the palace took up almost half of that, which Jonathan supposed made sense given the size of its primary occupant, Granath. The tower was near the center of the complex, and the sigil on its side was clearly visible, lit up in the night by some sort of magic. As the patrol of soldiers clanked down the road in their suits of armor, Jonathan and Edgar peeled off, heading into the darkness between two of the nearest mansions. Now that they were inside the complex, it was time for them to find the place where their armor and weapons were being held. The space between the mansions was dark and silent, and they would be safely concealed within here as long as it took for them to reach their destination. However, it did not connect with the other alleyways, and they would need to find a way out of here before long. The mansions themselves were all built in an array around the center, and they seemed to be all constructed in the same way. There were no windows on the bottom floors for some reason, and the mansions expanded as they went up into the sky. Most of them were hundreds of feet high, and they were far larger than they had any right to be, extending upwards rather than to the sides. This area had limited space, and as such, the various abodes of the well-to-do of the city had to expand towards the sky rather than across the ground. In any case, Jonathan and Edgar were not here to debate the finer points of city planning. They were there to reclaim their lost possessions and escape the city before they were killed by Granath and his forces. As they slunk through the city, they made their way towards the center slowly but surely, avoiding the many patrols of guards that circled the city. They were still dressed as guards, but it was too suspicious for them to be on their own, especially if they were heading through the shadowy places of the city center. The guards were all high-leveled, and the ones here were even more so, which meant that someone might be able to break through the effects of their masks. If that happened, it would be game over. However, they were able to avoid the greatest concentrations of guards, and were able to find their way to the center safely. The mansions grew larger the further they went, and the power of the guards that they saw went up as well. As they neared the palace itself, they saw their first Tier 2 guard. A giant of a man, clad in dark armor, strode at the head of 100-odd group of guards, each to his footsteps shaking the ground. He wielded a 10-foot-long sword, which was propped up on one shoulder, and the aura of power that streamed off of him in waves was so strong that Jonathan could feel it even from hundreds of feet away. However, it was nothing compared to the aura of pure dread that was coming from the palace in the center, an aura of rot and ruin that promised utter devastation to all who faced it. That was the aura of Granath the Despoiler, Lord of the Ash Heaps. Jonathan shuddered as he felt the effects of the aura on him. Granath was a monster beyond anything he had ever felt before. Compared to the aura of the guard captain in front of him, who was already too strong for him to fight, it was like a bonfire next to a torch. Edgar stood petrified next to Jonathan, frozen by the confluence of the two powerful auras. Jonathan reached out and touched the man's shoulder, causing him to snap out of his state. Jonathan could not see his eyes, but he could tell that Edgar was petrified by what he had felt. However, Jonathan was made of sterner stuff. He had suffered the wrath of the system itself. This was nothing. Besides, it wasn't like any of this overwhelming power was directed at them. It was simply like ambient noise, albeit noise that was extremely loud. Edgar eventually got over his fear, and he shook his head to clear the lingering fugue from being exposed to such powerful auras. Without saying a word, the two men kept on their way, waiting until the patrol led by the Tier 2 man had gone. They dashed across the main thoroughfare of the walled city a moment later, crisscrossing their way across the 100-foot-wide street. Jonathan had no idea why the street was so large, but it seemed to lead directly into the palace itself, heading through a vaulted arch that was almost 200 feet high. Either this building was built for giants, or Granath was very fond of large things. Given the stories that Jonathan had heard about Granath and his massive size, he was guessing that it was the former of the two options. Now that they were standing in front of the palace, rather than regarding it from afar, it was even larger than they had expected. The palace soared upwards, over 1,000 feet into the air, and the towers and turrets that adorned its surface were even larger. Unlike most buildings in this city, there were actual decorations on this palace, and they seemed to be made out of rock from the dungeon, now that Jonathan was able to get a good look at it. There were hundreds of statues around the top of the building, which he instantly realized were from the Medusa's grotto in the dungeon. It looked like Granath used the dungeon more as a source of decoration than anything else. "All right. We're here. Are you ready to go in?" Jonathan asked Edgar, noticing that the man was still a little pale from his close encounter with that guard captain earlier. The aura from Granath was still there, but it was mostly background noise by now, and both men ignored it. "I guess so. I needed a moment to get a grip on the situation, but now that I have acclimated to the presence of such a powerful being, I am feeling a bit better. The only time I felt anything of this magnitude was when some imperial tax collector came to my kingdom, and that man was only mid-tier 2. Granath is far beyond that." The man fell silent, and then started walking towards the palace. It seemed that he had found his courage, but needed to move now before his terror overcame him. Jonathan followed the man, looking out for guards. However, none came in the time that he took them to walk through the titanic archway, and they quickly secreted themselves behind a set of statues in the corner of the courtyard. The palace proper started a few hundred feet away, but the front area behind the gates was dominated by an ornately decorated courtyard, filled with statues and other monuments to Granath's wealth and power. In the very center was a statue of a massive worm-like creature with a humanoid head, that Jonathan could only assume was Granath. It was a terrifying image, no matter who it was. The sound of metal-clad feet reverberated across the courtyard, and another platoon of guards came stomping through the area, heading out into the streets. This one was not led by a tier 2, but the woman who did lead still projected a palpable aura of a peak tier 1. None of the fights that could be found in this place were ones that Jonathan and Edgar could win. As much as it pained Jonathan to think it, he was nowhere near ready to take on Granath yet. It would be like a dog trying to fight an elephant. As the guards receded into the distance, the two men ran across the courtyard towards another set of statues. They were playing it safe here, so as to not be caught off guard by a group of guards. At this point, their disguises would be seen through in an instant if any tier 2s came looking for them. Another group came marching out a half minutes later, and the two men took that opportunity to run across as they passed. In this way, they crossed the courtyard in a matter of minutes, eventually ducking into the palace. Looking at it from the outside, they had both assumed that the palace complex was a large array of different buildings, but now that they were looking at it, it all seemed to be one gargantuan edifice. Their goal would probably be secreted away in some treasury somewhere. As they hid behind another set of statues, Jonathan took the opportunity to take a look around himself. The palace hallway was far larger than it needed to be, extending up for almost 100 feet into the air. All of the doors that led to other rooms were similarly gargantuan, and the whole thing was bathed in the light of dozens of floating balls of fire. This was the palace of a true god among mortals, a being that was so strong that he had ruled these lands unopposed for millennia, or perhaps longer. Even worse, Jonathan was expected to fight him. He bit his lip to get rid of the encroaching dread, and kept moving. Now that they were in the palace, there were less shadows to hide in, and they would have to start acting like actual guards. Hiding in here would be more suspicious than simply walking through the halls. Edging out of their shadow, the two men started down the hallway, acting as if they were assured of their place in the world. A few minutes later, the noise of a patrol came down the hallway, and Jonathan gulped. It was time to see if their disguise was up to muster. As the group of guards rounded the corner, Jonathan noticed that their leader was tier 2. It was time to see if they could talk their way out of this. As the group of 50 or so guards neared Jonathan and Edgar, they stopped and regarded the newcomers. "Why are you two on your own?" the tier 2 asked, in deep and rumbling tones. It seemed that a lot of the people directly under Granath were made from the same mold. "Our captain sent us to check on something in the treasury," Jonathan said, keeping the tremor out of his voice with great effort. "However, we have never been there before, and as such don't know where it is." "Tell me, sir, are we going in the right direction?" Jonathan stood still, looking directly at the tier 2 in front of him. Beside him, Edgar was fidgeting slightly, unable to contain his nervousness. The guard captain looked at them for a few moments, and then nodded. Well, the treasury is 10 doors down the hallway, and to the left. After that, you have to go down the first set of stairs. Be quick though. Tardiness is not appreciated. Jonathan saluted, and Edgar followed suit a few moments later, just in time to allay suspicion. The two men started down the hallway, but were stopped by a cough from the guard captain. There is something off about you two, but I can't tell what, the guard captain said, beginning to turn around. Jonathan poured his mana into his mask, and the other man suddenly paused, and then waved his hand. I'm sure it's nothing though. Carry on, soldiers. As the man trudged off with his platoon in tow, Jonathan let out a breath that he hadn't been aware of holding. That had been quite stressful indeed. The two men continued without any further incident, making their way past the arched doorways and counting them carefully. When they had reached the 10th one, they had passed by the other platoons, none of which had even looked at them. Perhaps they assumed that any suspicious activity would have already been noticed by now. They stepped through the arch, and found themselves in a markedly smaller passageway that sloped downwards gently. There was a staircase on the right side, illuminated by the same floating balls of light as outside, and Jonathan started down it. Neither man had spoken since the encounter with the guards, as they were both too apprehensive about what they would find. The staircase was long and narrow, and it continued downwards for over 1,000 steps. The two men sped up at the midway point, and reached the bottom a few minutes later. They found themselves on a large landing, facing a series of desks, each of which was manned by a studious-looking accountant, poring over lists and bills. Nobody looked up as they entered, and Jonathan kept walking, looking straight ahead. They had made it to their destination, but whether they could safely abscond with their stolen possessions and escape the city before they were found was another story altogether. The treasury itself was behind a large metal door at the back of the accounting room, and it was guarded by two powerful Tier 2 fighters, clad in ornate plate mail that positively vibrated with power. The same went for their weapons, which were in good shape and were clearly not just for decoration. As Edgar and Jonathan neared, however, the guard stepped back, and the door opened behind them. Flashing his companion a look, Jonathan stepped inside, and waited for Edgar to follow him. That had been entirely too easy. The treasury itself was an awe-inspiring sight, a 1,000-foot wide room filled to the brim with treasure. Columns and pillars supported the ceiling, giving the entire thing an ancient look. Floating lights cast their illumination over the room, giving it an ethereal glow. The interior of the treasury was filled with piles upon piles of Leviathan marks, and other goods, which somehow were not as imposing as Jonathan had been expecting, mainly because of the drab color of the coinage of this realm, as opposed to the gold that he would have expected in any other world. However, it was still quite a bit of money, and when he reclaimed his storage pouch, he would take some of it with him. The strata of the piles seemed to be organized by age, with the dustiest items at the back, and the newer ones at the front. It took Jonathan almost no time at all to pinpoint the location of his belongings, and for Edgar to find him. Their goods were unceremoniously piled on top of one of the mounds of coins, and Jonathan quickly walked over to it, his shoes causing the carpet of coins to clink. "I guess we found it then," Jonathan said, as he picked up his storage device. As he did so, however, the room started to shake, and one of the piles of coins on the far side of the treasury erupted, spilling coins everywhere. A 20-foot-tall humanoid torso emerged, with skin the color of milk. Glowing blue lines covered its form, and soon the rest of its body emerged, a titanic worm, with ridged skin and thousands of scars. Jonathan Harlow. "We finally meet," the creature said, a twisted grin stealing across the face of its humanoid part. "I would introduce myself, but I am sure that you already know who I am." "Granath!" Jonathan exclaimed, shocked. This entire thing had been a trap. The worm snapped its tail, somewhere below the piles of coins, and the air shattered, propelling the Circle Lord forwards faster than Jonathan could see. The worm landed in front of the two men, and stared down at them. The air shifted as evidence of his passing, and Jonathan was almost torn off his feet by the wind caused by the skill that Granath had used. Or perhaps it had simply been pure brute force, which was even more frightening. So far, Granath was not exuding any of his aura, but Jonathan could still feel a naked threat heavy in the air, ready to come crashing down at any moment. "Did you plan all this?" Jonathan asked, fighting to keep the tremor out of his voice. "Did you know that we would come here? Did you really think that you could fool a being as old and experienced as me? I wanted to meet you in the flesh, and after learning that you somehow managed to escape from your confinement, that desire was inflamed even more. Before I devour your soul, I wanted to get a long look at the latest would-be challenger to my rule." As this was happening, Edgar, who was being ignored by Grant, was starting to edge back towards the door. Jonathan stepped forwards, trying to distract Granath for long enough for Edgar to get out. Perhaps one of them could escape. However, as he approached Granath, the worm-like monstrosity extended one of its hands, and lifted Edgar up into the air with a powerful display of telekinesis, and unceremoniously dumped the man onto a pile of coins nearby. "Anyone who consorts with people like Jonathan Harlow will not escape my judgment. I don't even know who you are, but your soul will still taste just as good." As the worm spoke, his mouth opened, and blue tentacles of mana started to drop out, writhing in the air. They moved towards Edgar at a sedate pace, and as they approached the man, something started to rise out of his body. It looked like a silvery shadow of his normal self, and it contained an amount of power that was far more than what was in Edgar's actual body. The shade fought to remain in its body, but it was nothing before the encroaching power of the Lord of the Ash Heaps, and the soul gradually was coaxed free of its constraints. Jonathan screamed in rage, and sent his mana rocketing towards the blue tentacles, trying to unbind them with his copious mana pool. A stream of purple mana raced out of his hand towards the writhing form of Granath, and it impacted the tentacles, slowly starting to taint them with its purple darkness. However, Granath simply raised one eyebrow, and Jonathan was lifted off his feet by a titanic backlash as his mana was forcibly ripped apart midair, exploding in his face. He impacted the wall, and lay there, groaning. Edgar was struggling, but it was of no use, and his soul was growing closer and closer to being devoured by the hungry abyss of Granath's maw. Now was the time for desperate measures, and although what he was planning might very well kill him, Jonathan got to his feet, and began to cycle his divinity through his body. As he did so, he drew upon his new skill editing ability, and forced his consciousness into the runes that made up his smite skill, searching for any that matched the rune of beckoning, or the rune of hatred. Upon finding both of them in the supremely complicated rune array, he poured his remaining divinity into them, causing his body to almost explode with power. His limbs glowed with the light of a small sun, and he felt as if he could destroy a building with a single punch. However, his body was burning away, and he only had a few minutes before he died. Jonathan raced forwards, his feet spreading flame across the ground, and reached his armor and weapons. He donned them in the blink of an eye, his hands moving like lightning, and he ran towards Granath, who seemed slightly surprised at Jonathan's turn of speed. The worm raised one hand and then brought it crashing down, sending a wave of telekinetic force towards Jonathan. However, he powered through the weak assault, relying on the fact that Granath had underestimated his new strength. Before the worm could attack again, slowed down as he was by his soul consumption, Jonathan leaped up and grabbed the blue tentacles of mana with his hand, pumping the raw power of the void into them. It was nowhere near enough to destroy the immensely powerful spell, but he managed to weaken them enough to grasp Edgar and tug him free of their embrace. The silvery soul slid back into its resting place, and Jonathan dropped to the ground, running towards the exit as if it was the last thing he would ever see. As he did so, he did something that he had been avoiding for a long time. He allocated all of his remaining stat points. Half of them went into strength, and half into dexterity, leaving one left over, causing his footsteps to suddenly increase in power, propelling him away from his enemy. He had possessed no time to split up the points, so it was just a raw 1.5 times boost. It was time to bring out all the stops. Granath roared in rage and slithered at high speed towards Jonathan, moving faster than he could run. Jonathan dodged to the side as he sensed the worm behind him, and the circle ruler almost crashed into the wall. However, his dexterity was on par with his level, and he swerved mid-rush to face Jonathan, opening his mouth wide. A spear of concentrated mana shot out of Granath's mouth, and impacted Jonathan, moving so quickly that he could not avoid it, even with his current level of power. A circular hole was blasted straight through his armor and chest, almost hitting his heart. The pain was blinding, but he barely felt it in comparison to the pain engulfing the rest of his body. Jonathan kept running, ignoring the blood leaking out of his body, and missing the fact that it was golden in color instead of its normal reddish hue. However, Granath did not miss that little detail. As Jonathan exited the treasury room less than a second later, the worm bellowed in rage. "You will not escape me, godling. That divinity is mine." Jonathan chilled upon hearing that declaration, but he kept running, only to be knocked off his feet by one of the Tier 2 guards. Luckily, nobody else had heard that, as Edgar had been unconscious and the guards had been behind the wall. He did not have time for this, and he rapidly burned his reminder of his stock of divinity to empower his next strike. Jonathan placed everything that he had in the attack, and as his body shriveled, he slammed his burning fist into the nearest guard's head. There was a crunch, and the man was sent flying off his feet. There was no explosion of blood and gore like there normally was, but Jonathan's strike still knocked the man out. However, he was still too weak to kill him. The other guard was distracted for long enough for Jonathan to rush past them, racing across the reception area and towards the stairs. Behind him, there was an apocalyptic crashing noise as Granath slammed through the stone wall that was surrounding the treasury, and slithered out onto the floor of the waiting area. His massive bulk crushed the accountants by the dozens, but he paid them no heed, instead snapping his tail and teleporting towards Jonathan and Edgar. Just before Granath reached them, however, Jonathan leaped into the stairwell and rolled forwards, heading up the stairs. Granath drove his leathery bulk into the bottom of the staircase, collapsing it, but Jonathan was already out of the way. He took the stairs 20 at a time, running faster than he had ever ran before. His body was almost on its last legs, but he still had enough left in the tank to get out of the palace. As he entered the hallways, he sped up, and he broke the sound barrier as he ran, so fast was he moving. The sonic boom echoed throughout the hallways, drawing the attention of the nearby guards. The floor beneath him buckled and warped beneath the force of his strides, but he ignored it all, focusing on carrying his charge to safety. Edgar was unconscious from whatever Granath had done to him, and the man was flopping bonelessly around as Jonathan ran. Guards spilled out into the halls as a blaring alarm started to sound, but Jonathan sped past them all, appearing as nothing more than a streak of light to the weaker ones. A Tier 2 appeared in front of him, and swung her massive axe at his legs, but Jonathan leaped over the lightning-fast blow, and kicked the woman into the wall as he passed. In this form, he was on par with a low Tier 2, it seemed. Jonathan reached the arched entrance to the palace mere moments later, and ran out into the night, heading for an alleyway. He could feel his bodily functions shutting down, and he wanted to make sure that he could get to safety before he collapsed. He reached an hidden alcove between two mansions a few seconds later, and fell forwards, landing in the bottom of a small stairwell leading up to one of the mansions. As he ebbed out of consciousness, he let go of Edgar, letting the man fall to the ground next to him. Some time later, the tremendous agony infusing his body drove him to consciousness, and Jonathan had to clap a hand over his mouth to prevent himself from screaming at the pain. It felt as if every inch of his body had been boiled in lava for hours, before being tenderized by a giant hammer. His bones were twisted, and his flesh was torn across his body. Edgar was still out for the count, and Jonathan was not in much better shape, unable to move at all. However, a sudden wave of essence surged into his body, more than he had ever felt before, and he jerked as his bones snapped back into position. There was only one explanation for it. He had gained experience from that Tier 2 he had knocked out in the treasury. He must have done more damage than he had thought. However, it was more of a temporary fix than anything, and his body was still in rough shape. He crawled over to Edgar, grunting as his body asserted its displeasure with his movements, and tapped the man lightly on the shoulder. Edgar groaned, and started to stir, and Jonathan quickly clapped a hand over the man's mouth as he began to say something. With the enhanced senses of people at their level, such a noise could be a death sentence. As Edgar looked up at Jonathan, panicked, he saw who it was, and he calmed down somewhat. A moment later, there was a rattling boom, and something shattered back in the palace, likely a wall that had gotten in the way of Granath's wrath. Now that Jonathan had stolen something from the worm, he was now vulnerable to him, on account of the restrictions of the universal law that he had found earlier. Even though he was most assuredly more than 3 times weaker than the worm, he had stolen from Granath, as well as physically attacked him, or at least his mana. In any case, it was now time to get the hell out of the Ashen Citadel, as it were. As Edgar regained enough strength to stand up, Jonathan got up as well, fighting to stay on his feet as the pure pain from having not only used Smite, but having enhanced it too, washed over him. It was far worse than when he had empowered his skills for the first time, as the effects of Smite lended a multiplicative bonus to the stress that his body was now under. He would not be able to use his trump card skill for quite some time after this. However, at least he was still alive, and with a few more levels under his belt for his troubles. Having killed a tier 2, even indirectly, had netted him a staggering 4 levels, which had barely stemmed the damage that his body had been dealt. However, once he was in better shape, those levels would be greatly appreciated. He needed every edge that he could get if he was to defeat Granath. The worm was far stronger than he should have been, even at the peak of tier 2, and Jonathan didn't doubt that he had some sort of additional power from his position as Circle Lord. In any case, it was now time for them to leave this place, before Granath himself caught up with them and killed them. Jonathan and Edgar hobbled down the alleyway and back towards the main road, looking out for any of the guards. Upon seeing none of them, they picked up the pace, and ran along the main road, keeping to the shadows. The massive mansions bathed the street in enough darkness for them to hide in easily, and as they heard the first platoon of guards come stomping down the road, they stuck closer to the shadows than before. It was still night out, and the guards marched right past the 2 men, ensconced as they were inside a small patch of shadow. However, the main problem was Granath himself, who they could hear slithering across the ground. The worm-like monstrosity passed by a few moments later, and was looking from side to side, as if he could detect their presence. As the worm passed by them, he turned to face their hiding spot, and without warning, a bolt of blue light shot out of the worm's mouth and towards where they were standing. Jonathan and Edgar aped apart, and the energy bolt struck the ground, drilling deep into it. They scattered, and heard Granath laugh loudly. The worm had now revealed his true size, and the beast was almost 300 feet long from head to tail, and stretched along a good chunk of the road from where he was now. As Jonathan and Edgar emerged into the light, the worm slapped his tail, creating a shockwave that tossed Edgar, who was closer to the worm's tail end, off his feet. It seemed like the worm was playing with them now. Jonathan darted out underneath Granath's ponderous bulk, and started running, trying to get past the worm before he could catch up. However, Granath had other plans, and the street around Jonathan dented, causing him to collapse as gravity suddenly increased in the area where he was standing. Granath loomed over him, and the worm grinned, revealing a mouth full of blue light. Bending down, Granath opened that same mouth wide, and began to tug at Jonathan's soul with his magic. Jonathan shouted as he felt his sense of being begin to drift out of his body, and he tried to keep a hold of it with his willpower. It felt like his mind was being ripped out of his body by force, and his awareness was split between his body and his soul, which was a disturbing experience indeed. There was no pain, only a profound sense of wrongness that was almost worse than any pain he could have suffered. Upon finding that it didn't work, he empowered himself with his divinity instead. Suddenly, his soul stopped moving towards Granath, and remained locked in place in front of Jonathan, resisting Granath's desires. The worm frowned, and clenched his fist, causing Jonathan to groan in agony as pain lanced through his body. However, he still did not let go of his soul. Behind Granath, Jonathan saw Edgar give him a woeful glance, before racing off into the alleyways. Jonathan did not blame the man for his actions, there was nothing that he could have done. His divinity was ticking down at a rapid rate, and he could feel that he would soon be out of energy. He closed his eyes, waiting for the end, but a sudden burning heat rose up in his chest and he looked down to see that the amulet he had received from the book in the ruined city was glowing brightly. A moment later, a beam of energy shot out of it, and slammed into Granath's head, knocking the worm backwards. There was a flash of light on his chest, and the amulet on his neck exploded, burning his skin. However, the grip over Jonathan's soul vanished, and he collapsed as his soul shot back into him. He got up a moment later, and started running. Gritting his teeth to prevent himself from collapsing again, Jonathan ran down the road, trying to get as far away from Granath as possible. He was shaky from his use of divinity, even though he hadn't been using his actual smite skill. The guards tried to stop him, but he dodged them easily enough and made his way towards the gate. Behind him, he heard a titanic roar of rage, and he redoubled his efforts, with every step feeling like someone was driving a nail through his feet. However, he ignored his damaged body, and reached the gate a few minutes later, finding, to his joy, that a group of soldiers was passing in, likely to deal with him. As they marched through the gate, he barreled through them, exiting a moment later. Someone tried to shut the gate, but they stopped as they saw that Jonathan was already through and out into the city. With a single shout of defiance, he was gone, melding into the darkness of the streets. However, he was not free and clear of this city yet. He had left his ally behind him, and he would not leave until he had found Edgar. Jonathan streaked off into the night, and quickly found somewhere to wait until dawn. There was a small tavern underneath a building in the nearby human district, and for some reason, it was almost completely hidden from the outside world. It was underneath a small trapdoor that was barely visible from the street, concealed as it was by a small bush. However, he knew that there was something down there. Jonathan suspected that it was a hideout for criminals, but did not voice such suppositions as he walked in through the nondescript trapdoor. The only reason he had been able to detect it was because of his enhanced senses smelling a faint odor of alcohol coming out of the trapdoor. The trapdoor led to a small flight of stairs, which opened into a well-lit room, filled with miscreants of all shapes and sizes. As Jonathan entered, a few of them looked up, but most of them did not seem to care, either too deep in their cups or simply dismissive of him. Off in one corner, a pair of burly men were duking it out to the delight of a small crowd of onlookers, all of whom seemed to have some sort of stake in the game. Jonathan surveyed the entire tavern, and quickly found a place to sit. The people in the bar were rough around the edges, but none of them bothered him, perhaps sensing from his armor that he wasn't a man to be trifled with. Jonathan sat there in silence, running over the events of the escape in his mind. Edgar had run off into the alleyways, and Jonathan suspected that the walled city had been locked down after he had escaped, which meant that Edgar had been locked in there. He was still in his guard armor, but that disguise would only last so long when someone like Granath was after him. As Jonathan sat there, a mangy-looking beast-man sat down next to him, scratching idly at a patch of receding fur on his back. The man looked to be some hybrid between a rat and a human, and he grinned over at Jonathan, revealing the massive incisors of a rat. "Fancy buying a drink for a poor soul?" the man said, his tone wheedling. Jonathan shook his head and went back to his contemplation. He felt a paw land on his shoulder a moment later, and he looked up, frowning at the still grinning rat man. "I'm not interested," Jonathan replied, sending a tiny pulse of his aura towards the man. Rather than be cowed, however, the rat man merely grinned wider. Jonathan was beginning to think that this man was completely insane. He felt a few presences gathering behind his back, and turned around to see a motley crew of rat men standing behind him, all of whom were carrying long, serrated knives. Jonathan scoffed, and ignored them completely, waiting for someone to make the first move. This was evidently something common in these parts, as nobody even looked askance at the escalating situation. "My friend here wants a drink. You don't want to deprive him of such a treat, do you?" The largest of the rat men asked, trying to sound friendly. Jonathan merely continued to stare forwards. A moment later the rat man punched Jonathan in the back of the head, clearly expecting something to happen. Instead, his fist broke on Jonathan's helmet, and Jonathan laughed. He was not wearing his mask right now, as he did not feel the need. Nobody here knew who he was, and those who did were too strong for the mask to work on them. He completely ignored his assailants, and smiled underneath his mask as he heard the rat man scream in pain from his broken hand. Another one of the rat men tried to grab at Jonathan, but he shot out his hand and knocked the man head over heels into a nearby wall with a casual flick of his wrist. The other men looked at one another and then backed off, leaving Jonathan sitting there in peace. A few other people surreptitiously made room for him as well, and he smiled wider. This was fun. However, now that he was unbothered by the riff-raff, he started to wonder what exactly had happened with his amulet when he had escaped Granath. It was gone now, but it had briefly outputted enough power to drive off a peak Tier 2 entity. There was clearly more to this story than he had thought. It was time for him to start reading the book. However, he would not do so here. He would have to find somewhere secure to begin plumbing the depths of the book. Jonathan got to his feet and walked out of the tavern, suddenly self-conscious about his exposed position. He exited through the same trapdoor that he had come in through, and noticed that there was a group of guards storming through the streets, presumably looking for him. He dashed into a nearby alleyway, to avoid their gaze, and closed his eyes. His armor was good for concealing himself from mundane assailants, but the guards knew what to look out for when they were trying to find him, which was his signature suit of black plate armor. At this point, the mask was useless, as the guards were both strong enough to avoid its effects, unless he was channeling it, and the presence of his armor made him stand out a lot more than before, causing the effects to diminish slightly. Jonathan waited until the footsteps had faded away, and then made his way out into the main street, mostly unconcerned with the few low-level passers-by that he could see from his space in the alleyway. He had no time for them right now. He needed to rescue his friend, and then leave the Ashen Citadel. After having seen Granath's power for himself, Jonathan knew that he would need to treat his path to power even more seriously than he had been so far. He would need to eke out every last bit of power that he could from himself until there was nothing left to give. There was a reason why Granath had never been defeated after all. However, rescuing Edgar was more important. Jonathan had only known the man for the better part of a day, but he could already feel a bond forming between him. For the most part, he was simply glad that he had found someone to share the burdens of his journey with. He had been expecting to have to embark on the long path of the Hellbreaker alone, but if he had a companion, perhaps it would not be so difficult. He had only been in this world for a bit over a month after all, and he had untold years to go until he finally was free, perhaps even millennia. If the years stretched on for so long, Jonathan would go insane, losing touch with himself. He would become nothing more than a walking vehicle of destruction and rage, with no reason other to live than his quest. Jonathan shook his head to clear the morose thoughts, and stepped out into the street, starting towards the center of the city. He was still quite close to the walled citadel that Granath made his home in, and he was only about a 15-minute walk away from it. However, he knew that getting in this time would be far harder than it had been last time. The streets were filled with a hushed sense of unease, and he caught more than a few glances from the people walking by, likely wondering why someone was wearing full-plate armor in the city. He hardly cared at any rate. As he walked, he got a better look at the city than before, and he had to admit, it was an impressive construction. For a city within an actual circle of hell. The buildings never reached a height of more than about 50 feet, but they were well built, and it seemed that the citizens had taken the opportunity to add a few of their own decorations to the place. This sector of the city was a human one, and as a result, the buildings looked quite similar to what Jonathan would imagine medieval Europe would have looked like, albeit without any wood in the constructions. The buildings were bulky, and their upper floors protruded outward into the street, likely to save space, similar to how it had been done in cities such as London in the olden times. At least nobody was emptying chamber pots into the streets, and in general, the city was quite tidy and well kept. However, Jonathan knew that even at level 10 or so, the need for basic human bodily functions was diminished, and that was probably the reason for the tidiness rather than anything else. Baskets of fake flowers hung out of windows, looking drab in the faint light that was available in the night. Lanterns hung off every building corner, acting as primitive street lights like back on Earth. However, the people themselves seemed depressed and hopeless, and the few that Jonathan did see out at this hour were all hunched over, and focused on their feet. None of them talked to each other, and they all looked at him in fear when they came across him. As Jonathan came closer to his target, he put his mask back on, just in case he could use it to deter some suspicion from the guards. It was not going to do too much at any rate, but its effects would still help somewhat. With his mask on, Jonathan looked like a strange hybrid of armor and monster, some half-formed creature out of the shadowy depths of the underworld. The lines and curves of his mask accentuated the darkness of his armor, and he looked like nothing more than a splotch of darkness in the night. In fact, it seemed that this was what he manifested as to those passing by, as nobody spared him a second glance again, after he put on his mask. Soon he was standing in the wall district, right in front of the hulking monstrosity of a fortification that separated the city proper from the abode of Granath. He could see it over the buildings, and he quickly realized why none of the mundane buildings in the larger part of the city were taller than 50 feet. It was likely so that nobody would use them to scale the walls and access Granath's compound. However, Jonathan was here to enter, and he could not let such a thing as a mere wall deter him. He strode purposefully through the darkness of the side streets, avoiding the patrols that he could hear circling the walls. The entire city was on high alert now from his little escapade earlier, and he had only waited this long in order for it to die down a little bit before he tried to enter the citadel again. It was in the early hours of the morning now, and the night was still dark, but there was a tiny shred of light on the horizon. If he did not hurry up, it would eventually be day. Within the citadel itself, Edgar hid within the shadow of a building, as a troop of guards stomped by. In his many years of life, Edgar had never experienced such abject terror as he did in the present moment. He was within a city that was out to kill him, and he was being hunted by beings who could destroy him in a matter of seconds. However, despite all of this, he was no coward, and he didn't let his fear paralyze him. It was only down to sheer luck that he had not been caught yet, and he had been using the alleyways and mansions as hiding spots. He was not well versed in the ways of espionage, but he was intelligent enough to recognize the sounds of a patrol coming his way, and to find where the optimal place was to escape. In this way, he had spent the last while flitting around the city, staying ahead of death by a few feet in some cases. He could not escape the place, as the wall was now far more heavily manned than before and no patrols were coming in and out. The entire citadel had been placed on lockdown after Jonathan had escaped, and Edgar knew that the man was most likely never coming back for him. He was only postponing the inevitable here in trying to escape his fate. All souls eventually died upon coming to the hells. Why would it be any different? Still, if he died here, he was content with his lot. He had at least tried to make a stand for what was right in the world, and although he had ended up failing utterly, confronted with the impossible strength of Granath, he was still content with what he had achieved. It was too bad that he would never be able to join Jonathan on his grand quest to destroy the hells, but he still knew that he had played a role, no matter how small, in the life of one destined for far greater things than himself. It was a morose, but also somewhat comforting thought, and it was the only thing that was letting him get by. He suspected that the patrols were far less assiduous in their search for him than they would have been had Jonathan still been here, and he knew that he was only seen as nothing more than a lackey of Jonathan's. If the full forces of the Ashen Citadel had been directed his way, he would probably have been dead by now. However, he was still among the living at the moment, and he did not intend to go easily into the embrace of death. If he lingered here, he could buy time for Jonathan to escape the city, which was all that really mattered. At that moment, Jonathan was lurking outside of one of the gates leading into the citadel, watching out for a patrol of guards to come tramping through. However, as the minutes stretched on, he realized that the entire inner city had been shut down, and the walls bristled with soldiers. Spotlights of mana shone down into the nearby streets every now and again, and Jonathan could see a few mages standing on the top of the battlements, holding wands and other magical foci. There was no way in, and no way out for Edgar. Jonathan pursed his lips as he looked at the defenses. He was still in rough shape from using smite, and he knew that a head-on fight would not go well for him. In addition, his amulet was now gone, and the mysterious protection that it had extended when he had fought Granath was also gone. He knew that if he met the monstrous worm again, it would spell his demise. The memory of the impossible strength of that monster still lingered within his mind, as well as the feeling of having his soul sucked out of his body. That would be something that he would remember for a long time. Jonathan ducked as he saw one of the spotlights change its trajectory, heading uncomfortably close to his position. He was relatively safe in his position, but he was wary of the light making a shadow of his figure, exposing himself to the watchers on the wall. Knowing the levels of those guarding the Ashen Citadel, they would notice immediately. All of the Tier 2 guards were basically guaranteed to have the advanced versions of their races, meaning that they had the enhanced senses that Jonathan had. If so much as a hair was out of place, they would notice it. The spotlight glanced over the top of the building, fading away after a few moments. Jonathan kept moving in the interim, heading closer and closer to the wall. There was little to no shelter the nearer one got to the wall, which was a clever security feature. No cover meant that nobody could get near it easily, and with the lockdown that the citadel was under, there was no way that he would go unnoticed. At least the cloud of eyes had disappeared, thwarted by his mask. The constructs had been too weak to peer through his disguise, and they had left, presumably evaporating into the ether. The mysterious entity, or entities, living within that tower had not shown themselves as of yet, and Jonathan was still unsure of who exactly had sent the spell construct, as well as the beam of light, after him. It was clearly someone of great magical power, but he was too unfamiliar with the layout of the city and the hierarchies of the ash heaps to know who it was.